Tonight, we explore a world where Jon Snow never went back over the wall. When the moment came to betray the wildlings, to climb south and warn the Watch, to choose the black cloak over the woman beside him, he didn't do it. He stayed. He stayed with Ygritte and Tormund and Mance Rayder's great host of the Free Folk, a crow among people who killed crows, a stark bastard in a world that didn't kneel to any name. It took him years. The Free Folk did not trust him, did not want him, did not believe a man who had worn the black could ever truly be one of them. He earned it anyway. Through winters survived and disputes settled, and promises kept when keeping them cost him blood. He became the closest thing the Free Folk had ever had to a true king. Not because he wanted the title, because the dead were coming, and someone had to hold the line. And he was the one still standing when the line needed holding. This is the story of a kingdom that was never meant to last, built by a man who never meant to build it, for people who never meant to follow anyone. This is the story of what might have happened if Jon Snow became king beyond the wall. The Wall. The night he didn't climb. 300 AC. The wall was right there. 700 feet of ice, blue-white in the moonlight, and the group was already at the base preparing the climb. Tormund had his axes out. Ygritte had her rope. The plan was over the top and down the other side, a raiding party into the gift. And Jon Snow was supposed to go with them because Jon Snow had been living among the Free Folk for months and had eaten their food and slept under their furs and fought beside them and bedded one of their women. And going over the wall with them was just the next thing. Except it wasn't. It was supposed to be the moment he went back. His whole time among the Free Folk had been a mission, the Half-Hand's last order. Die so the boy can live inside Mance's camp, learn what he can, and get word back to the Watch. That had been the plan. Go in, learn, come out, warn them. Betray the people who had trusted him, and go home to the Black Brothers who would call him hero for the betraying. Jon stood at the base of the wall and looked up at it and felt the whole weight of what he was about to choose settle on him like snowfall. He could climb, go south, find Castle Black, tell the Lord Commander everything, Mance's numbers, his route, his plans, the giants and the Thenns and the army of 100,000 Free Folk marching on the wall. He could do his duty. He could be what Corin Halfhand had died to make him, a spy who came home. And Ygritte would know. She was 10 feet away, checking her climbing gear, her red hair catching the moonlight. She had not looked at him in the last hour because she didn't need to. She trusted him completely, as a woman trusts a man she'd taken into her bed and her life and her world. She had vouched for him to Mance. She had fought for him when the Thenns wanted to gut him. She had loved him with the Free Folk's love, which was not gentle, but was absolute. If he climbed south and warned the Watch, she would know he had been lying the whole time. Every touch, every word, every night in the cave, all of it a performance by a crow spy who had used her body and her trust to get information for the men on the other side of the ice. It would not be entirely true. He had not been performing. The cave had been real. She had been real. But truth and how a thing looked were different animals, and from where Ygritte stood, the truth would look exactly like a lie. And the Watch. He thought about the Watch, the brothers, the wall, the vows. He had sworn. He had knelt in the snow in a godswood beyond the wall and said the words. And the words were supposed to be forever, and he had broken them already. Broken them with Ygritte, in a cave full of hot springs. Broken them by eating Mance's meat, and drinking Mance's mead, and fighting alongside men the Watch called enemies. The vows were already in pieces. Going back to the Watch now would not unbreak them. It would just move the broken pieces to a different shelf. He stood at the base of the wall in the cold. Ghost was behind him. The white wolf had been ranging. Ghost always ranged. He went where he went and came back when he came back. But he was close to night, sitting in the snow 20 yards from the climbing party, red eyes catching the same moonlight as Ygritte's hair. The wolf was looking at Jon with the patience of an animal that had decided a long time ago what it was attached to and was simply waiting for the attached thing to make up its mind. Snow, Tormund's voice, from the base. You climbing, or you growing roots? Jon looked at the wall. He looked at Ygritte. He looked at Ghost. I'm not going over, he said. The climbing party went still. Ygritte turned, her face in the moonlight. Sharp, fierce. The face he'd been looking at for months, and that still caught him off guard sometimes with how much of the north was in it. What? She said. I'm not climbing south, Jon said. I'm staying on this side. Tormund's heavy face did something between confusion and suspicion. You were going over with us? Mance said I'd go over and raid the gift. I'm telling you I won't. Jon looked at them, the raiding party. 6 men and Ygritte, axes and ropes and the expectation of the climb. I'll go back to the camp. I'll tell Mance I wouldn't cross. He can deal with me however he wants. He'll kill you, Tormund said. Flat, maybe, not maybe. He'll gut you. A man who won't raid, won't fight, that's a man with no use. And Mance doesn't keep men with no use. Then he guts me, Jon said. Ygritte crossed the space between them in 4 strides. She grabbed the front of his furs with both hands and pulled his face down to hers, not gently. What are you doing? She hissed. The right thing, he said. The first right thing in months. The right, you absolute. She let go of his furs. You were going south. You were going to go over that wall and run back to your crow brothers and tell them everything and leave me standing here like a... Yes, Jon said. The word landed between them. That was the plan, he said. That was always the plan. The half-hand sent me in to spy. I've been, he stopped. Started again. Every day I've been among you, I've been carrying it. What I was. What I was supposed to do. And I can't do it. I can't go over that wall and pretend the last 3 months were a trick I was playing. They weren't. He looked at her. You weren't. Ygritte's face went through several things very fast. Fury, hurt, something that might have been the beginning of understanding, buried immediately under more fury. You were a spy, she said. I was a crow. I was. He shook his head. I'm not anymore. That's what I'm telling you. I'm choosing. Right now. This side of the wall. Your side. My side doesn't trust crows, Ygritte said. My side kills crows. I know. And you think, what, you'll stay and we'll all just forget you were sent to betray us? You'll sit by the fire and eat our food and sleep in my furs and everyone will just... I think it'll take years, Jon said. I think most of them will never trust me. I think Mance will want to kill me and Tormund will want to beat me and the Thenns will want to eat me and you'll want to shoot me in the face with an arrow. He almost smiled. But I'd rather earn it honestly than pretend I already had it. I'm done lying. To you, to them, to myself. I'm done. Ygritte stared at him. Tormund stared at him. The climbing party stared at him. Ghost, behind them, lay down in the snow and put his chin on his paws, in the manner of a wolf that had known this was coming. Well, Tormund said eventually, he's either the bravest crow I've ever met, or the stupidest. He shouldered his axe. Could be both. Usually is. He looked at the wall. We're still climbing. With or without your Neela boyfriend. Go, Jon said. I'll be at the camp when you get back. If Mance hasn't opened you up by then, Tormund said. If Mance hasn't opened me up by then. Tormund shook his head. He turned to the wall. Ygritte did not turn. You lied to me, she said. Lo, just for him. I did. For months. Yes, and now you're choosing to stay. Here, with the people you were sent to betray. With you, Jon said. Mostly with you. Something in her face. Under the fury, under the hurt, under the free folk pride that would not bend for any man, let alone a lying crow, softened, not much. An inch. You know nothing, Jon Snow, she said. She turned to the wall. She climbed. Jon watched her go. He watched the whole party go, Tormund and Ygritte and the 6 raiders, ascending the ice face in the moonlight, going over to raid the country Jon had been born in, the country he was choosing not to return to. Then he turned south. No, not south. He turned away from the wall, into the true north, toward the free folk camp, and whatever Mance Raider was going to do to the crow who had just confessed to being a spy. Ghost rose and followed. Mance. What the king did with her honest liar. Mance Raider did not kill him. This surprised Jon more than it should have. He had walked back to the free folk camp expecting the worst, a knife in the dark, a trial by combat, a slow hanging from a tree, the things free folk did to crows they caught. He had walked into Mance's tent and said it plainly. I was sent to spy on you. The half-hand's plan. I was supposed to go over the wall tonight and warn the watch. Mance sat in his camp chair with the battered crown that wasn't really a crown. He didn't wear one. The free folk didn't kneel, and listened. When Jon finished, Mance was quiet for a while. You're telling me this why? Mance said. Because I chose to stay. And staying on a lie is worse than leaving on the truth. Most men would have just climbed the wall and gone home. I'm not going home, Jon said. I want this to be home. I know that doesn't mean much right now. Mance looked at him with the grey eyes that had seen everything between the wall and the land of always winter, the eyes of a man who had once been a brother of the Watch himself, and had left it for reasons Jon was only beginning to understand. You remind me of me, Mance said. 20 years ago. Younger, stupider, but the same basic problem. A crow who realized the wall is a lie, that it's just ice, that the people on both sides of it are just people. He leaned forward. The difference is I left because I wanted to. You left because of a girl. Not only a girl. Mostly a girl. Jon couldn't argue with that. The half-hand was my friend, Mance said. Did you know that? Before I left the Watch, Corin was one of the only men on that wall worth a damn. He had you kill him so you could get inside my camp. Mance's mouth twisted. That's a hell of a thing to carry, boy. Killing a good man to become a lie. I'm trying to stop being the lie, Jon said. And I'm supposed to trust that. No. You're supposed to decide whether keeping me alive is worth the risk. If I'm still a spy, killing me costs you nothing. If I'm not, if I'm what I'm telling you I am, you've got a man who knows the Watch from the inside. Their strength, their walls, their blind spots. Everything they taught me, I know. Mance studied him. The free folk won't trust you, he said. I know. Some of them will try to kill you. The Thens especially. Styre's been asking for your blood since you walked into camp. I know that too. And you'll take it. The distrust, the hate, the years of men spitting when you walk past. I'll take it. Mance leaned back. He looked tired. Not the tired of a single day, but the tired of 20 years of holding 100 quarrelling clans together through nothing but will and reputation. 20 years of being the only man all of them would follow, and none of them would love. All right, Mance said. You live. For now. One condition. Name it. You fight. When we march on the wall, and we are marching, Snow, whatever you think of it, 100,000 free folk are going south, because there's something coming out of the north that will kill us all if we stay. You fight with us. Not against the Watch. I know you won't raise a blade against your brothers, and I won't ask it. But when the dead come, and they are coming, boy, don't look at me like that. I've seen them. You fight beside us. The free folk and the crow's bastard, same side. That's the price. The dead, Jon said. You've heard the stories. Stories. They're not stories. Mance's voice changed. The charm dropped. What was underneath was older and colder and more afraid than Jon had seen him. I've been beyond the Frostfangs. I've been to the edge of the land of always winter. I've seen things that don't die when you kill them, Snow. Things that stand up again. Things with blue eyes that used to be men. He held Jon's gaze. That's why I'm marching. Not for plunder, not for glory, not because I hate the Watch. Because if my people stay north of the wall, they die, and they don't stay dead. I'm trying to save 100,000 lives. That's the whole of it, and I'll use a crow spy to do it if I have to. Jon stood in Mance's tent and felt the ground shift under him. He had heard the stories. Everyone at the Watch had heard them, the tales the Rangers brought back, the old legends, the things the oldest brothers muttered about and the youngest laughed at. White walkers. The dead rising. The long night. He had filed them where sensible men filed them, somewhere between fairy tales and the concerns of another age. Mance was not a man who believed in fairy tales. All right, Jon said. I'll fight. Good. Mance picked up his wine. Now get out of my tent before I change my mind. And Snow, Jon turned at the flap. Don't make me regret this. I've regretted very few things in my life, and I'd hate to start with you. Jon went out into the cold. He was alive. He was, somehow. Still alive. The first year. What distrust looked like. The free folk did not trust Jon Snow, and they were right not to. He had been a spy. He had admitted it to Mance, and word had moved through the camp as fire moves through dry brush, fast, hot, and leaving everything it touched changed. By the third day, every clan knew. The half-hands boy, the crow spy, the one who had been eating their food and fucking their woman and memorizing their numbers for the Watch the whole time. The fact that he had confessed, that he had chosen to stay, that he had refused to climb. None of that mattered in the first months. A man who had lied once was a man who could lie again, and the free folks' whole world was built on the principle that a man was what he did, not what he said he was going to do. And what Jon had done was lie his way into their camp for months. Styr of the Thens challenged him in the second week. The Thens were the hardest of the free folk clans, organized, militant, from the high valleys of the Frostfangs, a people who had kept the old ways in a form that was more rigid and more violent than anything south of the wall. Styr was their magna, which was their word for lord, though a Then would cut you for calling it that. He was tall and scarred, and had the flat, wide face of a man born in country where the wind never stopped, and he had wanted Jon dead since the first day, and now he had a reason. "Crow spy," Styr said, in front of 40 men in the center of the camp. "Admitted spy. Walks among us wearing a dead man's face. Mance keeps him alive. Mance's choice. But the Thens didn't choose Mance's choice." He drew his bronze blade. "Fight me. Die like a man instead of waiting to die like a dog." Jon looked at him. He had a choice. He could fight Styr and probably die, because Styr was bigger and older, and had been killing men since Jon was learning his letters at Winterfell. Or he could refuse and be marked a coward, which among the free folk was the same as dead, but slower. "All right," Jon said. It was not a good fight. It was an ugly, desperate, badly matched thing. Styr with his bronze blade and his years of killing. Jon with his common steel sword and the training Ser Rodrik had given him in the Winterfell yard, which was castle training, formal and formal clean fighting was nearly useless against a Then who fought the way avalanches fell, heavy and without rules. Jon lost. He lost badly. Styr put him in the mud inside 2 minutes, opened a cut on his arm and another across his ribs, and stood over him with the bronze blade at his throat and the camp watching. "Yield," Styre said. Jon looked up at him from the mud. He could yield and live. Among the free folk, yielding to a challenge was not death. It was submission, a statement that the other man was stronger and that the yielder accepted it. It was not honor, but it was survival. "I yield," Jon said. Styre held the blade at his throat for a moment. "Crow," he said, and spat and walked away. Jon lay in the mud and bled and felt the camp's eyes on him and understood, very clearly, that this was the price. Not one fight, years of fights, years of men like Styre who would test him and mark him and spit on him, and the only way through it was to endure it, the way rock endured weather, not by fighting the weather, but by still being there when the weather was done. Ygritte found him after. She cleaned his cuts with boiled wine and did not speak for a while, which was unlike her, and the silence told Jon more than words would have. "You could have run," she said finally. "Before the fight. Styre announced it at noon. You had 3 hours. Where would I run? South, over the wall, back to your Crow brothers. I told you. I'm done with the wall. Then you're an idiot, because Styre's going to challenge you again, and the next time he might not ask you to yield." She tightened the bandage on his arm with more force than was necessary. "He wants you dead, Jon. Not beaten. Dead. He's testing how far Mance will let him push it. Then I'll fight him again. And lose again. Probably. So what's your plan? Lose your way to respect?" Jon looked at her. "I don't have a plan," he said. "I have a woman who's angry at me and a wolf and a camp full of people who want me dead or gone. That's what I have. I'm going to keep showing up and keep breathing and keep being useful wherever someone lets me. And eventually, either they kill me or they stop wanting to. That's it. That's the whole plan." Ygritte stared at him with the expression that meant she was deciding whether he was worth the trouble. She had been wearing that expression a lot lately. "You really are the stupidest brave man I've ever met," she said. "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." She finished the bandage. "Come to bed. You look like shit, and you smell like mud, and I'm still angry at you for the spying, which we're not done discussing, by the way. We are never done discussing that. But you need sleep, and I need someone warm next to me. And you're the warmest idiot available." He went to bed. In the dark, with her body against his and Ghost somewhere outside doing whatever Ghost did in the dark, Jon thought about the Winterfell yard, about Robb sparring with him in the morning frost, about Arya watching from the fence, about the life he had given up. Twice now. Once for the Watch and once for the Free Folk. And he felt the full reach of what he had done. He was north of the wall with no name and no home and no standing, in a camp of people who were right to hate him, sleeping beside a woman who was right to be angry, carrying the debt of a lie he had not finished paying. He closed his eyes. He was still breathing. That was enough for tonight. Ygritte, the reckoning with the lie. The reckoning with Ygritte did not come all at once. It came in stages, over weeks, the way a wound that looked closed turned out to still be bleeding underneath. She did not throw him out. He had expected her to, the free folk way, with a man who lied, was direct, and usually involved the man sleeping in the cold until the lying was forgiven or not forgiven. But Ygritte kept him in her furs, kept him at her fire, kept the shape of the life they had been building before his confession, and the keeping was not forgiveness. It was the decision to have the fight slowly, over time, in the 100 small moments where the lie touched the surface of what they were, It came out in the mornings, mostly. Was this real? She would say, holding his face with one hand, looking at him with the direct fierceness that was the only version of her eyes he had ever seen. When you woke beside me the first time at the milkwater, was it real then, or were you lying beside me and counting troops in your head? It was real, Jon said. The cave was real. The first time you said the first time all of it was real, Ygritte. Every part of it. Then how is the lying also real? She dropped her hand. That's the part I can't make fit. You say the loving was true and the spying was true, and they happened at the same time in the same man. How does a man love and spy at once? How does a man hold a woman in the dark and plan to betray her in the morning? Which one is the lie? The holding or the planning? Both were true, Jon said, and both were wrong. I was a man carrying two things at once and trying not to drop either. I dropped one. You dropped the watch. I dropped the lie, he said. The watch was the oath. The lie was the spying. The moment I stopped spying, I stopped lying. The watch oath was broken months ago, in the cave. The moment Don't call it breaking, she said sharply. What we did in the cave was not breaking. Don't use their Neela words for it. You chose me. That's choosing, not breaking. He looked at her. You're right, he said. I'm always right. You keep forgetting. The reckoning went on for months. It was not one fight. It was 100 small fires, each one burning through another layer of the lie, each one leaving the thing underneath a little more exposed, and a little more raw, and a little more honest. She would be angry at breakfast, and warm at noon, and furious at dinner, the cycle running on its own clock. And Jon learned to ride it the way he had learned to ride the northern weather. You did not try to change it. You survived it. You came out the other side. What came out the other side, eventually, was not the old thing, not the woman and the crow, the easy fire, the first love that had been partly real and partly performance. What came out was harder and more real, a partnership built on the full truth, the ugly truth, the fact that he had lied and she had trusted, and the trust had been broken and rebuilt on a foundation that included the breaking. I forgive you, she said one morning, 6 months after the confession. She said it plainly, without build-up, as the free folk said important things, directly, without ceremony, the truth arriving undressed. Thank you, Jon said. Don't thank me. Thanking implies I had a choice. I didn't. I tried not forgiving you, and it was too much work. She pulled on her boots. You're still an idiot. I know. But you're my idiot. That hasn't changed. She looked at him. Don't lie to me again. Ever. About anything. Not about the watch. Not about the war. Not about whether the soup is good when it isn't. I'd rather have the truth every time. Even when the truth is ugly. Because at least the truth is real. And I can work with real. I won't, Jon said. Promise me. I promise. Good. She pulled on her other boot. The soup last night was terrible, by the way. I know. You said it was fine. That was before the promise. Then we're starting fresh. She stood. Today. Right now. Fresh. They started fresh. And the fresh was better than the old, because the fresh had the truth in it. And the truth, Ygritte had always known, and Jon was learning, was the only thing the free folk built anything real on. Tormund, how trust was built. Tormund Giantsbane came around first, and the coming around was not a moment but a season. It started with the hunt. The free folk camped in the Frostfang foothills through the first winter after Jon's confession, and hunting was constant because 100,000 mouths ate more than the frozen north could easily provide, and the hunters who went out did not always come back because the country was hard and the game was scarce, and there were other things in the deep woods that were worse than hunger. Jon went on every hunt that would have him. He went because it was the only work available to a distrusted crow. No clan would take him to their fire for counsel or strategy or the settling of disputes. Those were for trusted men, men who had earned their seat, not lying southerners with bastard names. But a hunting party that was short a bow did not much care about the bowman's history, and Jon could shoot, and more importantly, Ghost could track. And a direwolf's nose was worth 10 men's eyes in deep snow. Tormund was on one of those hunts when the thing happened that changed the shape of things between them. It was a routine hunt. Elk, maybe, or a stag if they got lucky, 3 days into the frozen wood on the edge of the Milkwater. Tormund and Jon and 4 others, the kind of small party that went quiet into the country and came back with meat if the gods were willing. The gods were not willing. They found tracks on the second day. Not elk. Something else. Large, wrong, deeper than any animal Jon knew, and the snow around the tracks had a quality to it, a coldness that was different from the ordinary cold, the kind of cold that made the hair on Ghost's spine stand up. Tormund looked at the tracks for a long time. "Whites," he said. "What?" "Dead men walking. I've seen the tracks before. Twice." He straightened. "We go back. We haven't found game. Game doesn't matter if you're dead, Snow. We go back. Now." They went back. And on the return, in the grey afternoon of the second day's walk, the thing that had made the tracks found them. It came out of the trees fast and wrong. A man, or what had been a man, moving with the jerking gait of something that was not alive, and was not dead, and was in the terrible space between. Its eyes were blue. Its face was grey. It moved toward the hunting party with the speed of something that did not tire and did not fear, and had no purpose but the killing. Jon had heard about whites. He had not seen one. The sight of it stopped him for a half-second that nearly killed him. The wrongness of it, a human body doing inhuman things, moving without breath. The blue eyes burning in a dead face. It bypassed everything he knew about fighting, and went straight to the part of him that was animal, that knew that this thing should not exist and could not be fought the way you fought men. Ghost hit the white from the side. The wolf, who feared nothing, who had padded through the haunted forest without raising a hackle, went at the dead thing with his full weight and his teeth, and the white went down, and Jon recovered from the half-second and drew his sword and started hacking. It did not die when he hacked it. He cut it, and it did not bleed. He took its arm off, and it kept coming. He put his sword through its chest, and it looked at him with the blue eyes, and reached for his throat with the remaining hand, and Jon understood, in a cold, horrible instant, that Mance had been telling the truth. The dead were real, and they did not die when you killed them. And the wall was not a relic of another age, but the only thing between this and the world. Tormund saved him. The big man came in with a torch, fire, the one thing that stopped whites, Jon would learn later, and put the flame to the dead thing, and it burned, and the burning stopped it, and the thing that had been a man collapsed in the snow, and was finally, fully dead. They stood over it in the cold, breathing hard, the 6 of them and the wolf, and nobody said anything for a while. "Still think Mance is telling stories," Tormund said. Jon looked at the burned remains of the white. "No," he said. Tormund clapped him on the shoulder. It was the first time the big man had touched him since Jon's confession, the first physical contact that was not a test or a warning, but the gesture of one man to another who had just been through a thing with him. "You fight well enough," Tormund said. "For a crow." It was not trust. But it was the first crack in the wall between them. And Jon filed it in the place where he was keeping track of the small gains, the inches, the long, slow work of becoming real to people who had every reason to keep him at arm's length. The march, what Mance couldn't hold. Mance's great plan, the march on the wall, the 100,000 free folk going south to escape the dead, fell apart in stages, and Jon watched it fall. The problem was not the plan. The plan was sound. Get south of the wall, put the ice between the free folk and the dead, survive. It was the only plan that made sense. The problem was that the free folk were the free folk, and a plan that required 100,000 independently minded, clan-loyal, fiercely individual people to do one thing together was a plan that was always going to break along the lines of human nature. The Thenns wanted to go first. They considered themselves the strongest clan and therefore entitled to the best position, which was the vanguard, which meant crossing the wall before anyone else and claiming the land on the other side. The Ice River clans wanted to go east, around the wall, through the Bay of Seals. They were fishing people, and the idea of climbing 700 feet of ice did not appeal to them, and they said so loudly. The cave dwellers from the Frostfangs wanted to stay. They had survived beyond the wall for 10,000 years, and they did not see why they should leave now, because Mance Rayder said there were dead things walking, which was a thing Mance said every winter, and which the cave dwellers considered just another reason not to listen to Mance Rayder. And the giants did not want to go south at all, because the giants had been south once, a long time ago, and the people south of the wall had killed them for it. Mance held it together. He was good at holding things together. It was the one talent that set him apart from every other free folk leader, the ability to sit in a tent with 4 chieftains who hated each other and walk out with all 4 of them going in the same direction. But the holding was getting harder, and Jon could see it, could see the tiredness in Mance's face, and the way the meetings ran longer, and the decisions came slower, and the chieftains pushed back harder. "He's wearing out," Jon said to Tormund one evening, after a council that had lasted 3 hours and resolved nothing. Tormund drank. "Mance has been wearing out for 10 years, Tormund said. "He's been king beyond the wall for 20. You know what that's worth? Nothing. There's no salary. There's no castle. There's no army that obeys because you tell it to. There's just Mance, in a tent, talking people into doing what they don't want to do, every day, for 20 years. He drank again. Man's tired. He's earned tired. Someone will have to hold them together if he can't." Tormund looked at him. "Don't. Don't what?" "Don't start thinking that. You're a crow who's been with us for a year. You've got the wolf and the girl, and that's about it. You start talking about holding the free folk together, and someone's going to put a knife in your ribs, and I won't blame them." "I'm not talking about me," Jon said. "I'm asking who." "Nobody." Tormund set the cup down. "That's the answer you don't want to hear. If Mance falls, nobody holds it. The clans go back to being clans. The Thenns go to the high passes, and the Ice River clans go to the coast, and the Hornfoots go wherever Hornfoots go, and the rest of us sit in the snow and wait for the dead to come eat us." He looked at Jon with something that was not warmth, but was close to it. That's why Mance matters. Not because he's the best fighter or the smartest. Because he's the only one they'll all listen to, even when they hate what he's saying. Jon filed this too. The thing about Mance. The irreplaceability of the one man who could hold a fractious people together. And the question of what happened when that man got too tired to keep holding. He did not think about being that man. Tormund was right. It was too early, too presumptuous, and the free folk would kill him for the presumption. But he started paying attention to how Mance did it. The methods, the listening, The way Mance sat with a chieftain who was angry and let the anger burn before he answered it. The way Mance gave ground on small things to hold firm on large ones. The way Mance remembered names and grudges and histories. The mental map of 100 clans and their internal politics, which was its own kind of warfare. Jon watched. He learned. He did not say anything about what he was learning. He had time. He did not know how much. The wall. How they didn't get through. Tom. The march south reached the wall, and the wall held. That was the simple version. The complicated version was that Mance's army arrived at the wall to find it defended. Not well, not deeply. The Night's Watch was 1,000 men guarding 300 miles of ice, but defended at Castle Black, the one point where crossing was possible for an army as large as Mance's, and 1,000 men on top of 700 feet of ice, with barrels of burning oil and a tunnel full of gates, could hold against 100,000 for a very long time. The assault failed. Jon was not in the assault. Mance had kept his word. He had not asked Jon to fight the watch, and Jon had not offered. He had stood in the Free Folk camp behind the tree line while the attack went in, and he had listened to the noise of it, the screaming, the mammoth bellowing, the crash of the tunnel's inner gate, and he had felt the wrongness of it in his chest. The knowledge that men he had trained with and eaten with and sworn beside were fighting for their lives a mile away while he stood in a camp doing nothing. The assault broke against the wall like water against rock. Mance lost men. Not catastrophically. The watch was too small to kill many, but enough, and the dying was the worst kind. Men burned by oil and crushed by ice. The ugly death that came from assaulting a fortress that had been built by magic 10,000 years ago to be unassaultable. And then Stannis Baratheon came. The Southern King arrived from the east with a mounted force, not huge, perhaps 5,000, but disciplined and armored and mounted, heavy cavalry hitting the Free Folk camp from the flank while the watch held the wall. It was a hammer and an anvil, the oldest tactic there was, and the Free Folk were caught between them. Mance surrendered. He surrendered because the alternative was the death of his people, not all of them. The Free Folk were too scattered for that, but the center of the host, the families, the children, the old. Mance knelt in the snow, which was a thing no king beyond the wall had ever done. And he knelt not because he was broken, but because saving his people was more important than saving his pride. And Jon watched him do it, and understood for the first time what being a king really meant. It meant kneeling when your people needed you to kneel. What happened next was complicated. Stannis wanted to burn Mance. The Southern King had a red priestess, Melisandre, they called her, a woman of fire and shadow, and she considered Mance's blood to be of value for some ritual Jon did not understand, and did not want to understand. Stannis wanted order, and the wall defended, and the wildling problem solved, and Mance represented the problem. Jon went to Stannis. He should not have. He was nobody, a bastard, a deserter, a man with no standing in any court, northern or southern. But he went, because Mance had kept him alive when he had every reason to kill him, and because the Free Folk did not have anyone else who could speak the language of lords and politics, the language of the South. He found Stannis in the Lord Commander's tower at Castle Black, which Stannis had commandeered with the assumption of a man accustomed to living in other people's buildings. Stannis Baratheon was everything the stories said. Hard, gaunt, a jaw that looked like it had been designed for grinding grain, eyes that assessed everything and approved of nothing. "You're the bastard," Stannis said. "Ned Stark's by blow, the one who went over to the savages. The Free Folk, your grace. Savages with a better name is still savages." Stannis sat behind the Lord Commander's desk like a man who owned it. "Why are you in my presence?" "Because you're going to burn a man who surrendered," Jon said. "And I'm asking you not to. Mance Rayder is a deserter of the Night's Watch and a traitor to the realm. His punishment is death. His people are 100,000 strong, your grace. You've captured Mance. You haven't captured them. If you burn their king, they scatter, into the hills, into the Frostfangs, into the country you can't reach, and the dead find them one by one and add them to the army that's coming for all of us. Stannis looked at him. The dead, Stannis said. The White Walkers. The Whites, the things beyond the wall. Jon held his ground. I've seen them. Mance has seen them. The free folk are running from them. That's why they came to the wall, not for plunder. Because the dead are coming south, and the wall is the only thing between them and everything else. Stannis was quiet for a long moment. The Lord Commander has said similar things, he said. Old Mormont, before he was killed, the reports from the Rangers. He ground his jaw. I am not a man who believes in fairy tales. Neither was I, Jon said. Then I fought one. Stannis looked at him with the flat Baratheon assessment. No warmth, no charm, just the cold arithmetic of a man deciding whether another man was useful. What do you propose? Stannis said. Let the free folk through the wall. Settle them in the Gift, the lands south of the wall, mostly empty. They farm, they fish, they defend the wall's southern approach. When the dead come, and they will come, 100,000 free folk between the wall and the north is a shield. Better a living shield than a dead army. You're asking me to settle savages in the king's own land. I'm asking you to choose between an enemy of 100,000 dead men and an ally of 100,000 living ones. Stannis ground his jaw again. I'll consider it, he said. Which from Stannis was nearly an agreement. You may go. Jon went. He had bought time, not a solution. Stannis was not a man who gave solutions easily, but time. And time was what the free folk needed, while the question of what came next was still open. Mance was not burned. Not immediately. Stannis kept him as a prisoner, a useful prisoner, a man who knew the true north better than anyone alive and whose knowledge of the dead was worth more than his blood. And the free folk sat at the wall, waiting, caught between the ice and the dead and the southern king, who had not yet decided whether they were an ally or a problem. Jon went back to the camp. He found Tormund by the fire. Well, Tormund said. He's thinking about it. The southern king is thinking. Tormund spat. While my people freeze in the mud outside his wall, he's thinking about it in a way that ends with your people alive, Jon said. That's more than you had this morning. Tormund looked at him. The big man was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet Jon saw the thing that Tormund rarely showed. The fear. Not for himself. Tormund was not afraid of dying, but for the clans, for the families, for the children who were sleeping in the cold while kings decided their fate. You talk to a southern lord, Tormund said, in his language, about our people. Yes, no free folkman could have done that. No, because we don't kneel, we don't beg, we don't talk to lords in their own tongue about settlements and shields and political arrangements. We fight or we die. That's what we know. Tormund looked at the fire, and here you are, the crow who stayed, talking to kings about us, getting Mance's life saved, maybe because you know how to speak Kneeler. I'm not kneeling, Jon said. I'm translating. Tormund held the fire's light for a moment. Aye, he said. I suppose you are. He drank. You're still a crow. But you're a useful crow. He looked at Jon. I've never said that about a crow before. Don't make me regret it. People keep telling me that, Jon said, because you keep giving them reason to worry. Tormund drank again. Sit, drink. The southern king can think until morning. We'll still be freezing when he's done. Jon sat. He drank. He had done something today that none of the free folk could have done. He had stood in a southern lord's hall and argued for a people who were not his by blood or birth, but who were his by choice. And the arguing had kept a man alive and might keep 100,000 people from being left to the dead. It was not trust yet. But it was the beginning of a different kind of value, not the fighter's value or the hunter's value, but the thing Mance had been for 20 years, the bridge between people who could not speak to each other, the man who could walk into both worlds and translate. Jon had not planned to become that. He had not planned any of this. But here he was. Ibichubon, Grite, The years between. The settlement happened slowly. Stannis agreed grudgingly on conditions that were harsh and that Jon negotiated down to merely unfair. Because negotiating with Stannis Baratheon was like negotiating with a stone wall that occasionally made small concessions out of strategic interest rather than kindness. Free folk came through the wall in groups. Not the whole 100,000. Many of the clans refused, choosing the frozen north over the kneeling they believed the south would require. The Thens went back to the Frostfangs. The cave-dwellers disappeared into the deep places they had always lived. The giants went west, into the mountains, away from men and their smallness. What came through was perhaps 40,000. Families, children, old people. The clans that were willing to try something other than freezing. They settled in the Gift, the empty lands south of the wall, and the settling was hard, because free folk did not farm and did not build and did not stay in one place, and learning to do all three took years and cost lives and produced a generation of children who grew up in a world their parents barely recognized. Jon stayed north of the wall. He could have gone south with the settlers. Stannis had grudgingly offered the bastard of Winterfell, whatever else he was useful, and Stannis collected useful things. But Jon had watched the free folk split and had seen the ones who stayed behind and had known in the same place where he had known he couldn't climb the wall, that his place was with the ones who hadn't crossed. Ygritte had not crossed. "I'm not living south of that thing," she had said, jerking her chin at the wall. "I'm free folk. I was born in the true north, and I'll die in the true north, and no southern king is going to put me in a field with a hoe and call it a favor." "It's safer south," Jon had said. Safe. She had said the word like it tasted bad. "You southerners and you're safe. You choose safety over everything, over freedom, over the sky, over being what you are. I'm a woman of the north. I'll take my chances with the north." Jon had not argued. He had learned in 2 years that arguing with Ygritte when she had made up her mind was like arguing with the weather. You could do it, but the weather was going to do what it was going to do regardless. They stayed north, and the years passed. Jon would look back, later, and be unable to say exactly when the shift happened, when the free folk who remained beyond the wall stopped seeing him as the crow who stayed and started seeing him as one of their own. It was not a moment. It was an accumulation. It was the winters survived side by side, the hunts where he pulled his weight, the disputes he was asked to mediate because he had the stark gift of listening to both sides without losing his temper. It was Ygritte and she was his anchor, his translator in the other direction. He had learned to speak Nila to the south. She taught him to speak free folk to the north. Not the language. He had the old tongue well enough by the 3rd year, but the rhythms, the values, the things you could say and the things you could not, the way pride worked differently above the wall, and the way a man's reputation was built not on his name, but on the things he had done and the people who would vouch for him. She vouched for him. Every day. Not with words. Ygritte was not a woman who explained herself, but with her presence beside him, her willingness to share his fire and his furs and his mistakes, the simple fact that a free folk woman of good standing had chosen him, which said more to the free folk than any speech Jon could have made. They had a son in the 4th year. Ygritte bore him in the winter, in a cave in the Frostfangs, the way free folk women had been bearing children for 10,000 years, with a fire and a knife and another woman and no Maester anywhere within 100 leagues. Jon had waited outside the cave in the snow with Ghost and Tormund had drunk steadily and told stories of his own children, 7 by 3 different women, all of them enormous, and had kept Jon from going mad with the waiting. The boy was dark-haired and loud and had Ygritte's ferocity and Jon's grey eyes, and they named him Tauren, which was a northern name, a Stark name. a name Jon chose because it belonged to the last king in the north who had bent the knee. And Jon thought it was the right name for a boy born between worlds. Ygritte held the baby and looked at Jon over the small dark head with an expression he had not seen on her before, softer than her usual fierceness. The face a woman showed when the world had given her a thing she had wanted but had not expected to get. Torren, she said, testing the name. Sounds like a Neela name. It was a king's name, Jon said. A king who knelt, she said. Fitting, for the son of a crow. The son of a free woman and a crow, Jon said. She smiled, the full Ygritte smile, the one that made everything else. The cold, the danger, the years of earning and fighting and losing, worth it. You still know nothing, Jon Snow, she said. But you're learning. Winterfell. The news that came through the wall. News came through the wall in fragments, the way water came through cracks in rock, not a flow but a seeping, irregular and incomplete. And Jon assembled the picture of the South as he assembled everything else, in pieces. Robb was dead. That was the first piece, and it arrived in the 5th year, brought by a watch ranger who had been trading with free folk on the edge of the gift and who had mentioned it the way men mentioned old news they assumed everyone already knew. The Red Wedding, they called it. The phrase. Guessed right broken. Robb and his mother, Catelyn, dead in a castle on the Green Fork. Jon sat with the news for a long time. He sat by the fire and held it and felt it, not as he had felt his father's death. That had been fresh. A blade, the immediate pain of a wound still bleeding. This was older. Robb had been dead for years by the time Jon heard. The grief arrived pre-aged, like wine that had been sitting too long, still potent, but with a different quality, a flatness. The knowledge that the thing you were grieving had been true for years, and you had been walking around not knowing it. He thought about the boy in the Winterfell yard, Robb with the wooden swords, Robb laughing, the brother who had been warm where Jon was cool, who had been easy where Jon was careful, who had loved openly where Jon had loved at a careful northern distance. Gone. Ygritte found him by the fire. Someone's dead, she said, reading his face. My brother. Robb. She sat beside him. She did not ask how or when. The how and when did not matter to the free folk, who understood death as the one appointment every person kept. She sat and put her hand on his back and held the touch there, warm and steady. He was the one you left for, she said. He was the one I left the watch for, before I left the watch for you. Was he a good man? He was a good boy. I don't know what kind of man he became. Jon looked at the fire. I'll never know now. She held the touch on his back. The South killed him, she said. Not a question. The South killed him at a wedding. Guessed right broken. She was quiet for a moment. That's the thing about the South, she said. They make rules. Guessed right, oaths, laws, and then they break them when the breaking serves them. And they act surprised when the rules stop meaning anything. She looked at him. The free folk don't have guessed right. We don't need it. Because we don't pretend to keep rules we're willing to break. We fight or we welcome. And you know which one you're getting because we don't smile at you over bread and then put a knife in your back. It's not all like that, Jon said. No, but enough of it is. She pressed her hand harder against his back. You chose the right side of the wall, Jon Snow. Grieve your brother. He sounds like he deserved better, but don't make the mistake of thinking you should have been there. You couldn't have saved him from a thing you didn't know was coming. I might have. You might have died beside him. That's all. 2 dead wolves instead of 1. She held him. Be alive. Be here. That's the thing you can do for him now. Jon was quiet for a long time. Later, more news filtered through. Arya, alive somewhere, the rumors said. Nobody knew where. Sansa, married and remarried, and caught in a web of southern politics that Jon could not untangle from 800 miles away. Bran and Rickon, alive maybe, the stories contradicting themselves. Winterfell, burned and rebuilt, and changed hands twice and burned again. The home he had left was a different place now. The family he had left was scattered or dead. The South he had turned away from had done to his family everything he had feared it would do, and he had not been there because he had chosen the North, and the choosing had been right, and the rightness did not stop the grief. He held the grief the way he held everything, carefully, without letting it consume him, because there was work to do, and people who needed him, and a son who was growing up in a world that did not have time for a father lost in southern mourning. Torrhen learned his father's southern history in pieces, over years, the way Jon had learned it, not as a story told all at once, but as a thing that emerged, name by name, loss by loss. The Stark family tree that had shed its leaves one by one until the branch Jon sat on was the only one left. "Are we Starks?" Torrhen asked once, at 6 years old, sitting on Ghost's back and looking at his father with the grey eyes that were, unmistakably, the eyes of Winterfell. "We're free folk," Jon said, "but there's Stark in you, on my side." "What's a Stark?" Jon looked at his son. Ygritte's ferocity, Jon's silence, the grey eyes, the boy who had been born in a cave in the Frostfangs and who had never seen a castle, and who did not know what a lord was. "A Stark is a wolf," Jon said. "Like Ghost. A northern wolf." "I'm a wolf." "You're the most northern wolf there is." Torrhen accepted this with the absolute satisfaction of a 6-year-old who had just been told he was a wolf, and went back to trying to get Ghost to run, which Ghost tolerated with dignity. Jon watched his son and felt the Stark in him, the old thing, the Winterfell thing, the thing that his father had put in him and that he had carried north and that lived now in a boy who would never see the Godswood at Winterfell, but who carried its blood regardless. The South was gone. The family was gone. But the blood was here, in a boy on a wolf, in a cave in the north, growing up free. That was enough. The disputes. How Jon became the man they brought things to. It started with a goat. Jon would laugh about it later, that the beginning of whatever he became among the free folk started with a goat. But that was how it happened, and the goat was not funny at the time. 2 clans, the Hornfoots and a band of river people from the upper Milkwater, had a dispute over a goat that had wandered from one camp to the other during a blizzard. The Hornfoots said the goat was theirs. The river people said the goat had come to their camp of its own will, and a creature that chose its own camp was free, the same as any person, and free folk did not return free creatures to masters. It was, on its face, the stupidest dispute Jon had ever heard. It was also, underneath the goat, a proxy for a territorial argument that had been building for 3 seasons. The Hornfoots' grazing land and the river people's fishing camps were too close together, and neither clan would move, and the goat had become the thing the larger fight was being fought over, because fighting over a goat was easier than fighting over a boundary. Mance would have settled it. In the old days, Mance would have brought both chieftains to his fire and talked for 3 hours, and walked out with a line drawn on the snow that both sides grumbled about and grudgingly observed. But Mance was south of the wall now, not imprisoned exactly, but contained, and the free folk who remained beyond the wall had no Mance to bring their goat problems to. Someone brought it to Jon. He did not remember who. A woman of the Hornfoots, he thought, an elder who had seen him mediate a smaller thing between two hunters a month before, and who had decided that the crow's bastard had the temperament for it. She brought the goat problem to Jon's fire, and Jon looked at it, and Jon did what he had watched Mance do 100 times. He listened. He listened to the Hornfoot chieftain, who was angry. He listened to the river people's elder, who was angrier. He let them talk until the talking was done, and then he asked questions. Not about the goat, about the land, about the grazing and the fishing, and the 3 seasons of friction that the goat had crystallized. And the questions were Mance's trick. The thing Jon had been watching. You asked until the real problem emerged from behind the presenting problem, and then you solved the real problem, and the goat sorted itself out. He drew a line. Not in the snow, on a piece of hide, with charcoal, a map of the 2 camps and the river between them. He gave the Hornfoots the northern grazing and the river people the southern fishing. And he put a day's walk of unclaimed ground between them, and he told both sides that the goat could go where the goat pleased, because it was a goat, and goats did not care about boundaries. The Hornfoot chieftain grumbled. The river elder grumbled louder. Both of them accepted it, because the line was fair, and because neither could argue with the fairness without looking greedy. And greed was the one thing free folk despised more than kneeling. The goat went to the river camp. Nobody cared, and word got out. It got out the way things got out among the free folk, through the network of clans and campfires and travelling women who carried news between bands. The crow's bastard settled the goat thing. The crow's bastard drew a fair line. The crow's bastard listened before he talked and drew on leather before he drew a blade. More disputes came to Jon's fire. Not all at once, and not from every clan. But steadily, over the 5th and 6th year, a trickle of problems found their way to the camp where Jon and Ygritte and the boy lived. Grazing rights, water disputes. Marriage negotiations between clans that didn't trust each other enough to negotiate directly. Small things. The kind of things that kept a scattered people from tearing itself apart in the long winters between the greater conflicts. Jon settled them. Not always well. He made mistakes, gave ground he shouldn't have, drew lines that one side or another thought unfair. But he made fewer mistakes than most, and the ones he made he admitted to, and the admitting earned him more than the settling did, because free folk trusted a man who could say he was wrong more than a man who insisted he never was. Ygritte watched all of it. "You're becoming Mance," she said one evening, after a long session with 2 Hornfoot elders who had fought about a wife. "I'm not. You are. The listening. The questions. The drawing on leather. The fair line nobody likes but everybody takes. You're doing what Mance did." She looked at him across the fire. "You know what happened to Mance. He held the free folk together for 20 years. And then he lost them. They scattered. The wall beat them. And they scattered. And Mance knelt in the snow, and everything he built for 20 years fell apart in a day." She poked the fire. "Is that what you want?" "I don't want anything," Jon said. "People bring me their problems. I try to help. People brought Mance their problems too, and then they started expecting him to have answers. And then the expecting became demanding, and then the demanding became the thing that wore him down until he was a tired old man in a tent who couldn't hold them anymore." She looked at Jon. "I'm not warning you off it. I know you can't stop. The listening is in you like the colds in the north. It's just there. But I'm telling you what I see. Because someone should. What do you see?" "I see the free folk making a king," she said, "whether the king wants it or not." Jon sat with that for a while. He did not say she was wrong. She had never been wrong about the free folk, not once in 6 years, and he had long since stopped treating her observations as anything other than the truth arriving ahead of schedule. "If it comes to that," he said. "When?" She corrected. "If it comes to that," he repeated. "I won't make Mance's mistakes. Name one." He tried to hold them with will. Just will, his personality, his reputation, his charm. When those ran out, he had nothing else. No structures, no agreements they'd signed on to, no system that would hold without him standing in the middle of it. Ygritte looked at him for a long time. "You're not wrong," she said. "But structures and agreements are Neela words. The free folk hear those words, and they hear chains. Then I'll need to find free folk words for them, Jon said. You'll need to find something, she agreed, because the dead aren't getting further away. And when they come for real, not scouts, not strays, but the army Mance was afraid of, the free folk are going to need more than a goat settler with a piece of leather. She went to check on Torrhen. Jon sat by the fire. He was becoming Mance. He did not want to be Mance. He had seen what Mance had become. Worn down, exhausted. A man who had given 20 years to a people who had not quite given those years back. But the thing was happening regardless. The same way the tides happened regardless of whether the shore wanted them. And Jon could not stop it without stopping being the man he was. So he did not stop it. He let it happen. He kept settling disputes and listening to chieftains and drawing lines on leather, and the trickle of problems became a stream, and the stream became the beginning of something that the free folk did not have a name for yet, but that Jon did. Leadership. The kind that was not demanded but offered. The kind that came not from a crown or a title but from the slow accumulation of 100 small decisions made fairly. He was not king yet. He was not even close. But the shape of it was forming, in the firelight, in the snow, in the lines on leather, and the problems solved. And the people who brought their goats and their wives and their boundaries to his fire were, without knowing it, building the foundation of a throne that the free folk would never call a throne, but that would, when the dead came, function as one. Mance, the old king's last council. Mance came back beyond the wall in the 8th year. He was older. That was the first thing Jon saw. Not a man changed by a single blow, but a man who had been gently eroded, the edges of him worn smooth by time and imprisonment and the exhaustion of decades spent carrying a people on his back. He was thinner. His hair was going grey. His eyes still had the sharpness, the intelligence that had let him hold 100 clans together. But the sharpness lived in a face that was tireder than the last time Jon had seen it. Stannis had released him. Not out of kindness. Stannis did nothing out of kindness, but because a Mance raider at the wall was a liability, and a Mance raider among the free folk beyond the wall was, potentially, a stabilizer. And Stannis had finally learned what Jon had told him years ago, that the free folk beyond the wall were not going away, and that someone needed to keep them from becoming the next problem. Mance walked into Jon's camp on a Tuesday in late autumn and looked around at what was there, the fires, the structures, the children, the men and women who had stayed north after the great splitting, and his face did something complicated. "You've been busy," Mance said. "It's been 8 years," Jon said. "You've settled the Hornfoots and the River clans. Mostly. You've drawn boundaries that both sides observe. Mostly. You've got a son." Jon looked at Torrhen, who was 4 and underfoot and making a determined attempt to climb Ghost's back, which Ghost was tolerating with the dignity of a wolf who had decided that tolerance was easier than conflict. "His name is Torrhen," Jon said. "A Stark name," Mance said. "A northern name, for a boy born north of the wall." Mance looked at Jon with the old assessment, the look that had let him see through men for 20 years, the look that had seen through Jon's original lie and decided to keep him alive anyway. "You're doing my job," Mance said. "Somebody had to." Nobody had to. That's the thing about it. The free folk don't need a leader. They need a listener who makes fair decisions. And that's not the same thing. But it turns into the same thing if you do it long enough. He sat by Jon's fire, with the tired movement of a man whose body had decided that sitting was always going to be the right choice now. "I'm not going to take it back." Jon looked at him. "I'm not here to reclaim the title," Mance said. I'm too old and too tired, and the free folk who stayed north don't know me anymore. They know you. Their children know you. Their disputes have your lines on them. I'd be coming in over the top of a man who's been doing the work for 8 years, and that's a good way to break the thing instead of helping it. I don't have the title, Jon said. Nobody's called me. They don't have to call you anything. You are what you are because you do what you do, and titles are Neela nonsense anyway. Mance held his hands to the fire. I came back because I'm tired of the South. Because this is home, and because I hear things are getting worse up north, in the deep places, and I want to be useful while I still can. What things? Mance looked at the fire. The dead, he said. They're not strays anymore. The rangers, the few the watch still sends, they're coming back with stories. Not 2 or 3 whites stumbling through the woods. Hundreds, moving together. Moving south. He looked at Jon. It's coming, Snow. The thing I spent 20 years running from. It's not a future threat anymore. It's a present one. Jon sat with this. How long, he said. Seasons, maybe less. The cold is getting worse. The winters are getting longer. The signs that the old women talk about, the signs from the stories, they're all showing. Mance held the fire's warmth. The long night is coming. The real one. Not the name we give bad winters to scare children. The real one. And when it comes, the free folk who stayed beyond the wall are going to be the first thing it eats. Unless someone holds them together, Jon said. Unless someone holds them together, Mance agreed. He looked at Jon. You're already holding them. That's why I'm here. Not to take it back, to help you finish it. To teach you the parts I know that you haven't learned yet. The Thens. The giants, the clans that won't come to your fire because they don't know you well enough or because they knew me and they don't trust my replacement. You're offering to be my advisor. I'm offering to be an old man by your fire who knows things you need to know and who doesn't want his people to die. Mance's mouth twisted. Don't call it advisor. Advisor is a Neela word. Call it whatever the free folk call an old man who talks too much. I've earned that. Jon looked at the man who had been king beyond the wall for 20 years, who had united the free folk once and lost them and come back grey and tired and still, underneath it all, carrying the same thing Jon was learning to carry. The weight of a people who would not be carried, but who needed carrying regardless. Stay, Jon said. Stay. As long as you want. My fire's your fire. Mance nodded, the nod of a man putting something down. Not the crown. The crown had been gone for years, put down in the snow when Stannis' cavalry came, and Mance knelt to save his people. Something else. The last of the responsibility, the last weight of being the man in charge, transferred, in the quiet of a campfire, to the man who had been doing the job without the name. Good, Mance said. Then sit. I'm going to tell you about the Thens. Jon sat. Mance talked about the Thens and the giants and the cave dwellers and the ice river clans and the 100 small nations that made up the free folk. Their histories and their grudges and the things that moved them, the keys that unlocked their trust and the tripwires that set off their fury. He talked through the evening and into the night, and Jon listened with the full attention of a man who understood that he was receiving a gift, not a title, not a crown, but the accumulated knowledge of 20 years of leadership, given freely by a tired man who wanted his people to survive. Ygritte brought them food. She sat with them for a while, listening to Mance talk about clans she knew and customs she had grown up with, and once she interrupted to correct him on a point of Hornfoot genealogy, and Mance accepted the correction with the good grace of a man who knew he was being corrected by someone who was right. She's sharper than you, Mance said to Jon, when Ygritte went to put Torrhen to bed. I know. Keep her close. A leader without someone to tell him when he's wrong is a leader who's already failing. She tells me I'm wrong approximately every day. Good. Then you've got a chance. Mance drank. The free folk won't follow a man who's always right. They'll follow a man who's wrong sometimes and admits it. Remember that. Jon remembered. The Thens. The hardest trust. The Thens came back in the 9th year, and they did not come gently. Styr was dead by then, killed in the assault on the wall years ago, a death that Jon had not mourned because Styr had tried to kill him twice. But the Thenns had a new Magna, Styr's son, Zegorn, a man who had inherited his father's suspicion of outsiders and his father's militant pride, and who was, underneath both, smarter than his father had been, which made him more dangerous and more potentially useful. They came down from the Frostfangs in a hard winter, driven by the same thing that was driving everything south: the dead. The deep places were becoming uninhabitable. The white activity was not occasional anymore. It was constant, a pressure. The dead gathering in the valleys and the passes that the Thenns had called home for 1,000 years. They could not stay. So they came to Jon's territory, which was not formally Jon's territory, but which everyone beyond the wall understood to be the area where Jon Snow settled disputes and kept order, and where a man could camp without another clan's raiders burning him out in the night. Zegorn did not come to Jon's fire. He made his own camp 3 miles south of Jon's and sent a messenger, a deliberate insult, the Thenn way of saying we acknowledge your presence without acknowledging your authority. Jon could have been offended. Mance, sitting by the fire, told him to be offended. If you let the Thenns set camp in your territory without coming to your fire, every clan in the north will take it as a sign that you can be walked over. Or they'll take it as a sign that I don't need men to kneel before they can sit, Jon said. Mance looked at him. You're going to go to him, Mance said. I'm going to go to him. That's either very smart or very stupid. Could be both, Jon said. Usually is. He went to the Thenn camp. He took Tormund because Tormund was large and loud, and the Thenns respected size, if nothing else. And he took Ghost because the wolf was a statement that required no words. Zegorn received him sitting. Another insult, a free folk man stood to greet a guest, and sitting was the Thenn way of saying you are not worth the effort of my legs. Zegorn was tall and hard-faced and young, maybe 25, with the flat features of the high valleys and eyes that were assessing Jon the way his father had assessed him 10 years ago. Snow, Zegorn said. Magnar, Jon said. You're the crow. Not a question. I was. A long time ago. Once a crow, always a crow. Tormund shifted behind Jon. The big man did not like the Thenns, and the not liking was mutual and ran back generations. I'm not here to argue about what I was, Jon said. I'm here because you camped in territory that I keep. The clans around here, the Hornfoots, the river people, the bands along the Milkwater, they have agreements, boundaries. If you're staying, you're part of those agreements. If you're passing through, we'll provision you, and you can move on. But you don't camp without talking to me, because the people who live here have my word that their land is their land, and I keep my word. Zegorn looked at him. My father said you yielded to him, Zegorn said. In the mud, in front of the camp. I did. Your father was a better fighter than me. Might still be, if he'd lived. So why would I listen to a man my father beat? Because your father's dead, and you're in my territory, and the dead are behind you, and winter's getting worse, and the choice you have right now is between talking to me or going back up the Frostfangs and dying there. Jon held Zegorn's gaze. I'm not asking you to kneel. I'm asking you to sit at a fire and draw a line on some leather. That's it. A line. Your clan's place. Fair. Nobody takes your land. Nobody raids your people. Nobody tells the Thenns how to be Thenns. You just have to agree that the land is where I say it is. Same as everyone else. Zegorn was quiet. My father would have killed you for speaking to him like that, he said. Your father's dead, Jon said again. Not cruelly, just the fact of it. Zegorn held the silence for a long moment. Draw the line, he said. Jon drew the line. On leather, in charcoal, the way he drew them all, a boundary that gave the Thenns the high country south of the Frostfangs, with access to the milkwater for water, and enough grazing for their goats, and enough game for their hunters. Not the best land, not the worst. A fair line. Zigorn grumbled. Every chieftain grumbled. That was how Jon knew the line was fair. If both sides grumbled equally, the line was in the right place. "Welcome," Tormund said to Sigurd as they left, "to whatever this is." "What is it?" Sigurd said. "Nobody knows," Tormund said, "but it's better than dying." They went back to Jon's camp. Mance was waiting. "Well," Mance said, "they're staying. I drew the line." Mance nodded. "The Thens were the hardest part when I did it. If you can hold the Thens, you can hold anyone." He looked at Jon with something that was not quite pride. Mance was not a man who expressed pride easily, but was in the neighborhood. "You're getting good at this." "I've had a good teacher," Jon said. "You've had a tired teacher," Mance corrected. "You've been good at this from the start. I just told you how to avoid the traps I walked into." Jon did not know what to say to that. "Go to bed," Mance said. "The Thens are in. The hard part's over. Everything from here is just time and the dead." He paused. "And the dead are the easy part. At least the dead all want the same thing." Jon went to bed. Ygritte was already asleep. Torren curled against her, ghost at the cave's entrance, the small domestic scene that Jon came back to every night, and that he tried not to think about losing because thinking about losing it made the having of it feel borrowed rather than owned. He lay down beside his woman and his son and closed his eyes. He was holding the free folk together. Not all of them. The clans that had gone south through the wall were beyond his reach, and the ones that had scattered into the deep north were beyond anyone's reach. But the ones who remained, the maybe 30,000 who had stayed beyond the wall and who had slowly, over 9 years, started bringing their problems to his fire, those he was holding. It was not a kingdom. It was not even an organization. It was a web of agreements drawn on leather and kept by trust, held together by a man who had once been a crow and was now something that the free folk did not have a word for. He was not king, not yet, but the shape of it was close and getting closer, and the dead were coming. And when they came, the free folk were going to need more than a dispute settler with a piece of charcoal. They were going to need a king. Jon closed his eyes and tried to sleep, and knew, in the way a man knows the season is turning before the first snow falls, that the time for settling goat disputes was almost over, and the time for the other thing was almost here. The dead. How they came. The dead came in the 10th year, and they did not come the way Jon had expected. He had expected an army. The stories, Mance's stories, the Rangers' stories, the old legends that every free folk grandmother told to keep children inside at night, all described the White Walkers coming as a military event, an army of the dead, marching south, the Night King at their head, the end of the world in a column of frost and blue fire. What came was not an army. It was a pressure. It came from the north, from the land of always winter, from the deep places where no man went, and no man had gone for 8,000 years. It came as cold, a cold worse than any winter Jon had lived through, a cold that killed the breath in your mouth, and turned water to ice in your water skin, and froze the ground so hard that you could not bury the dead, which was the first problem, because the dead that you could not bury did not stay dead. The small bands started coming south first. Hunting parties, groups of 4, 5, 8 whites, not organized, not directed, just dead men stumbling through the forest with blue eyes and the remnants of whatever they had been wearing when they died. Free folk, most of them. Men and women who had been killed in the deep north and who had gotten up again and who were now walking south toward the living. They killed a Hornfoot hunting party in the first week. 7 men, gone out for elk, found dead 2 days later with their throats torn and their eyes already turning. The Hornfoots burned them, because the free folk knew by now that you burned the dead, or the dead got up. But burning 7 men was one thing. Burning the deer carcasses they had been carrying was another. Food lost. In a winter that was getting worse, the dead eating the living's supplies as efficiently as they ate the living. Then the whites started coming in larger groups. Dozens, then hundreds. Moving through the forests in packs, not quite organized but trending south, drawn toward the living by whatever drew the dead toward warmth and breath and blood. Jon's scouts, he had scouts now, men who ranged ahead of the camps the way the Watch's rangers had once ranged, came back with reports that were getting worse every week. There's a line of them along the Frostfang passes. One scout reported, a hard-faced Then, who had started as one of Sigorn's men and had gradually drifted into Jon's network, because Jon's network was where the information went. Not moving, just standing, thousands of them, like they're waiting. Waiting for what? Jon said. For whatever tells them to move, the scout said. He did not look frightened, the Thens did not show fear easily, but his hands were not steady. There's something behind them, further north. I didn't see it. But the cold coming off that direction is different. It's not winter. It's something else. Jon took this to his fire. He sat with Mance and Tormund and Sigorn, who had, in the last year, started coming to Jon's councils, not as a subordinate but as an ally, the Then pride intact, but the Then practicality overriding it, and they talked about what the scouts' report meant. He's coming, Mance said. The Night King. I told you, years ago, the army Mance spent 20 years running from is finally here. How many? Sigorn said. All of them, Mance said. Everyone who ever died beyond the wall, every free folk man and woman who fell in the deep north and wasn't burned, every ranger, every animal. The dead don't recruit, they collect, and they've had 8,000 years to collect. So we fight, Tormund said. With what? Sigorn cut in. We've got 30,000 people north of the wall. Half of them can't fight. Children, old people, the sick. The dead have, what, 100,000? 200? And they don't tire, and they don't eat, and they don't break when you kill the man beside them. We fight the dead head on, and we lose. So we run south, Tormund said. Through the wall, join the ones who already crossed. The Watch won't open the gates, Jon said. Not for 30,000 free folk, not without a fight. And a fight at the wall while the dead are coming from behind is the worst of every option. Then what? Tormund said. He was frustrated, his voice rising. We stay and die? We run and die at the wall? What's your plan, Snow? You've been settling goat disputes for 10 years. What do you do when the problem isn't a goat? The tent was quiet. Jon looked at his hands, at the fire, at the men around him, Tormund, who trusted him and was afraid, Sigorn, who barely trusted him, and was hiding his fear behind contempt, Mance, who had seen this coming for 30 years and was too tired and too old to run from it again. We hold, Jon said. Hold where? Here, the fist of the first men, the gorge of the Milkwater, the choke points between the Frostfangs and the wall. Jon had been thinking about this, not for days, for years. In the back of his mind, the soldier's habit of reading terrain and filing it for the battle that hadn't come yet. The dead are coming south. They have numbers, but they don't have siege equipment. They don't have tactics. They walk toward the living and they kill. That means bottlenecks work. Narrow passes, river crossings, defensible ground. We put our people behind the choke points, we burn everything between us and the dead that can be burned, and we hold. With what weapons? Sigorn said. Steel doesn't kill white walkers. You know that. Dragonglass does. And fire kills whites. Jon looked at the fire. The Watch has dragonglass. There's a cache at Castle Black, Sam told me, years ago, found buried in the snow. And there's more at Dragonstone, where Stannis came from. We need it. We need as much of it as we can get. The Watch won't give us dragonglass, Tormund said. They will if they understand what's coming. Jon said, because the wall doesn't stop White Walkers. The wall stops Whites. The dead can't cross the magic in the ice. But the White Walkers are something else. If they get through, if the wall falls, if they find a way around, everything south of the wall dies too. He looked at each of them. The Watch isn't the enemy. The Watch is the other half of the same wall. They need us the same way we need them. We just have to make them see it. And you'll translate, Tormund said. Yes, Jon said. I'll translate. The tent held the silence for a moment. So the plan is, hold the passes, get dragonglass, and make the crows understand that the dead are coming for all of us, Sigurd said. He looked unimpressed. That's not a plan, that's a prayer. It's a prayer with choke points, Jon said. Tormund laughed. The Tormund laugh, huge, sudden. The sound of a man who had decided something was funny because the alternative was screaming. A prayer with choke points. I've lived my whole life on prayers with choke points. He looked at Jon. All right, Snow. You want to hold the North against the dead. I'm in. Not because I think it'll work. I think we're probably all going to die. But because dying in a line next to men I chose is better than dying alone in the snow. Sigurd looked at Tormund. At Jon. At Mance, who nodded. The Thenns will hold, Sigurd said. Because if the dead take the North, they take our home. And a Thenn who won't fight for his home isn't a Thenn. He looked at Jon. But you're the one holding this together. If you fall, it all falls. You understand that? I understand it, Jon said. Good. Then don't fall. They went out of the tent into the cold, into the winter night, into the country that was slowly filling with the dead, and Jon stood in the cold and felt the full weight of what he had just agreed to do, to hold 30,000 living people against an army of the dead in a frozen wilderness, with dragonglass he did not yet have, and allies he had not yet convinced, and a wall of ice that was not his to command. Ghost came out of the dark and pressed his shoulder against Jon's thigh. I know, Jon said to the wolf. I know. He went to find Ygritte. He needed to tell her what was coming, and he needed her to tell him he was not insane for trying to stop it. She was in the cave, with Torren asleep on the furs. Well, she said, we're holding. Against the dead. Against the dead. She looked at him for a long moment. The firelight on her face, the red hair, the fierce eyes that had first looked at him over a drawn bow in the Frostfangs 10 years ago, and had never stopped seeing through him since. All right, she said. That's it. What do you want me to say? You've decided. I've been watching you decide for a year. The listening face, the counting face. The face you make when you're drawing lines on leather that aren't about goats anymore. I knew it was coming. She shifted Torren on the furs, the sleeping boy, heavy and warm and oblivious. I'm staying. We're staying. The free folk don't run from their land, Jon. That's the one thing we've never done. Not for the Starks, not for the Watch, not for the dead. We stay and we fight, and if we die north of that wall, where we belong. You're not dying, Jon said. Neither are you, she said, not aloud. I haven't finished teaching you things. What things? Everything. She pulled the furs open. Come to bed. The dead can wait until morning. They're very patient. He came to bed. And in the dark, with his woman and his son and his wolf, Jon Snow lay awake and thought about the morning, when he would begin the work of turning 30,000 scattered free folk into something that could stand against the night. The choosing, how a king was made. Nobody chose Jon Snow as king beyond the wall. That was the truth of it. and Jon thought about it often afterward. That there was no ceremony, no coronation, no great moment when the clans assembled and raised their voices and declared him their sovereign. The free folk did not do kings the way the South did kings. There was no crown. There was no oath. There was only a name that people started using because the using was easier than not using it, and by the time Jon realized they were calling him king, it was already true. It happened in pieces. The first piece was the dragon glass. Jon went to the wall, not over it, not through it, but to the gate at Castle Black, with Tormund beside him and Ghost at his heel, and a request that would have been laughed out of any southern court. He asked the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch for dragonglass. The Lord Commander was not a man Jon knew. Old Mormont was dead, killed by his own men at Craster's Keep, Jon had heard, years ago. The kind of death that made you wonder whether the watch was worth saving, or whether it had already died and was walking around not knowing it. The new commander was a man named Dennis Mallister, old, careful, a Southron lord who had taken the black and risen through tenure rather than talent. "You're Ned Stark's bastard," Mallister said, looking at Jon across the yard of Castle Black with the expression of a man examining a specimen. "The one who went over to the wildlings. The one who's been living with the free folk for 10 years, Jon said, and who's come to tell you the dead are real and coming south, and that the free folk are willing to hold the passes north of the wall if you give us the means to do it. The means being our dragonglass. Your dragonglass that's sitting in a storeroom doing nothing." Yes, Mallister looked at Tormund, at Ghost, at the country beyond the wall, which was colder than it should have been for the season, the kind of cold that had a quality to it, a wrongness. "The reports from the Rangers say similar things," Mallister said, grudgingly. "The dead are gathering. The cold is wrong. We've lost 12 men in the last year to things we can't explain." He ground his teeth. "But giving dragonglass to wildlings is free folk," Jon said. "Giving dragonglass to free folk is arming the people we've been fighting for 8,000 years. How do I know you won't turn those weapons south? Because the dead don't care which side of the wall you're on, and if the free folk fall, you're next. You've got 1,000 men on this wall. The dead will have 100,000. You need a shield. We're the shield. All you have to do is give us the glass." The negotiation took 3 days. Jon did not lose his temper. He had learned, in a decade of settling disputes, that losing your temper in a negotiation was the same as drawing a sword in a fistfight. It ended the conversation and started a different one you didn't want. He got the dragonglass. Not all of it. Mallister kept half, which was fair. The watch needed its own weapons. But enough to arm the free folk fighters. Enough to tip arrows and forge blades and give the living a chance against the dead that they had not had before. When Jon brought the dragonglass back beyond the wall, the clans came to look at it. They came from every camp and every territory. The Hornfoots and the River People and the Thens and the scattered bands that lived in the far places. They came because dragonglass was legend, was story made real, was the weapon that killed White Walkers, and the man who had gotten it was the man who had walked into the Watch's own castle and talked them out of their most precious resource. Nobody said king. But the way the clans looked at Jon that evening, carrying crates of obsidian through the snow to the free folk fires, the black glass catching the firelight, the way they looked at him was different from how they had looked at him before. Not warmer, necessarily, not softer. But the way men look at a man who has just done a thing they could not have done, and who did it for them. The second piece was the defense. Jon organized the free folk into something they had never been, a coordinated military force. Not an army. The free folk did not do armies, did not march in columns, did not take orders from a chain of command, but a network of bands, each holding a pass or a river crossing or a stretch of defensible ground, connected by riders who carried messages between them, and coordinated by a man who had a map in his head and on his leather that showed where every band was and what it was holding. It was Mance's model, refined. Mance had held the free folk together by force of personality. Jon held them together by system, by the agreements on leather, by the boundaries that everyone had signed on to, by the simple fact that every chieftain who had brought a dispute to Jon's fire had already accepted his authority to draw lines, and the defense was just another line, drawn on a larger piece of leather. Tormund held the Milkwater Gorge, Sigorn held the Frostfang passes, the Hornfoots held the eastern woods, the river clans guarded the coast, and Jon moved between them, checking positions, adjusting lines, bringing dragonglass where it was needed, and pulling fighters from quiet sectors to reinforce loud ones. It was not a kingdom, but it functioned like one, and the free folk, who had never had a word for what they were building, started using the only word they had for a man who held many clans together. "The king beyond the wall," Tormund said, one evening, over fire and meat. He said it the way Tormund said everything, flatly, with a grin underneath, the tone of a man testing whether a joke was also the truth. "That's what they're calling you. They shouldn't be. Shouldn't's got nothing to do with it. You hold the passes, you drew the lines, you got the glass from the crows. You're doing what Mance did, but Mance would tell you himself, you're doing it better." Tormund drank. King beyond the wall. Jon Snow. The crow that became one of us. He raised the skin. "I've known worse kings. Hell, I've known worse men. It doesn't mean anything." Jon said, "It means everything." Tormund set the skin down. "It means that when the dead come, and they're coming, Snow, we can feel them. 30,000 free folk will fight because a man they trust told them where to stand. That's what a king is. Not a crown, not a castle. A man who makes other men stand when standing is the last thing they want to do." Jon looked at the fire. He did not argue, because Tormund was right, and arguing with the right was a waste of warmth. The name stuck. King beyond the wall. Jon Snow. The crow who stayed. Nobody knelt. Nobody swore an oath. Nobody asked him to be their king. They just started being his people, and he started being their king. And the dead were coming, and there was no time to argue about what to call it. The long night. How it began. The long night began not with a battle, but with a silence. Jon was at the fist of the first men when it started, the ancient ringfort on the hill, where the free folk had made their command post, the place where the messages came in from the outlying positions and where the map on leather showed the whole shape of the defense. He had been up since before dawn, reviewing Sigorn's latest report from the Frostfang passes, when he noticed that the birds had stopped. Not gradually, all at once. One moment there were ravens calling in the frozen pines, and the next there was nothing. A silence so complete, it felt like a physical pressure, as if the air itself had become too cold to carry sound. Ghost stood up. The wolf had been lying by the fire, the one place Ghost was ever still, and he rose and turned north, and every hair on his body stood on end, and he made a sound Jon had never heard from him. Not a growl, not a whine, something between them, something that communicated, in the wordless way of wolves, that the thing they had been waiting for was here. Jon went to the edge of the ringfort and looked north. The sky was wrong. Not dark. It was mid-morning. The sun should have been visible even through the winter cloud, but dark regardless, a darkness that was creeping south across the tree line like a shadow with nothing casting it, like the light was being consumed at its source. And in the darkness, under the pines, moving through the frozen wood with the terrible silence of things that did not need to breathe, the dead were coming. He had known they would come. He had built the defense around the certainty of it. But knowing a thing and seeing a thing were different. And seeing the dead army of the land of always winter pour through the northern forest in a tide of blue eyes and grey flesh and frost that killed the trees it touched, seeing it was the thing that no amount of planning prepared you for. "Light the signals," Jon said. The signal fires went up, the chain of pyres that Jon had ordered built along the ridgelines, the relay system that could communicate from the Frostfangs to the Milkwater in minutes. One fire, then two, then a dozen. the message running south and east and west across the free folk territories. They are here. They are coming. Hold your positions. The first battle was at the Frostfang passes, and the Thenns held it. Jon heard about it afterward, from the riders who came south with the news. Sigorn's Thenns, 500 strong, armed with dragon glass and fire, holding a gap in the mountains that was 40 feet wide and 1,000 feet tall, the kind of ground where a disciplined force could hold against numbers that would have overwhelmed them on open terrain. The dead came through the gap in a rush, hundreds of wights packed into the narrow space, and the Thenns met them with fire and obsidian and the fierce martial discipline that was the one thing the Thenns had always been best at. They held. They held through the first day and the first night, and into the second day, and the bodies of the dead piled in the gap until the wights were climbing over their own fallen, and the Thenns burned the piles when they grew too high and fought on the ashes. Sigorn lost 40 men in the first 2 days. The dead lost uncountable numbers, but the dead had numbers to lose, and the living did not. The second battle was at the Milkwater Gorge, and Tormund held that. Tormund held it as Tormund held everything, with his body, his voice, and the sheer gravitational force of being a man so large and so loud that the people around him could not imagine retreating while he was still standing. The gorge was wider than the Frostfang passes, 100 yards across at its narrowest, and the dead came across the frozen river in a wave that was wider than the line Tormund had drawn. He held it anyway. He held it with fire. Trenches of burning oil. The old trick. The only trick that worked reliably against wights. And he held it with men, free folk fighters who had been hunters and raiders and goat herders a year ago, and who were now soldiers, because Jon had trained them to hold a line, and Tormund had given them the courage to do it. The cost was terrible. Tormund lost 100 men in the first 3 days. 100 free folk fighters, dead, burned before they could rise again, the living army shrinking at a rate that could not be sustained. If the dead had been a conventional enemy, the math would have been simple. At this rate, the free folk would be destroyed in a month. But the dead were not conventional. And the defense was not a line, it was a web, a network of positions that supported each other, and when one position was pressed too hard, Jon shifted fighters from quieter sectors to reinforce it, and when the dead shifted to find the weak point, the quiet sector's original defenders came back, and the defense breathed, in and out, as a living thing breathes. Jon ran the network from the fist. He did not fight in the first week. He wanted to. Every part of him that was Ned Stark's son, every instinct that said a leader fights at the front, wanted to be in the line with Tormund, or Sigorn, or any of the other men who were bleeding and dying in the passes. But Mance had told him, in one of the last conversations they'd had before the dying started, a king who fights in the line is a hero for an hour. A king who holds the map is a leader for a war. Don't be a hero, Snow. Be the man who keeps the whole thing from falling apart. So he held the map. He moved the pieces, he read the reports from the signal fires, and adjusted the defense, and sent dragonglass where it was running low, and pulled exhausted fighters out and rotated fresh ones in. He did it for 7 days, and the defense held, and the dead kept coming, and the living kept dying, and the math kept getting worse. On the 5th night, Jon went to the Milkwater. He went because Tormund's messages had stopped coming for 6 hours, and 6 hours of silence from a man whose natural state was noise was the most alarming thing Jon had experienced in the war so far. He left the fist in Sigorn's hands and rode hard through the frozen dark with Ghost ranging ahead, and the country between the fist and the Milkwater was a graveyard, dead trees, frozen ground. The remains of white groups that had been caught by patrols and burned, the black smears on the white snow that marked where the living had met the dead, and, for the moment, he found Tormund alive. The big man was in the gorge, sitting on a rock, covered in white blood and his own, an axe in each hand, and the remains of what had been a night-long assault scattered down the canyon behind him. His right arm was hanging at a bad angle. He had a gash across his forehead that had bled into his beard and frozen there, giving him the appearance of a man whose face was half ice. "You came," Tormund said. He sounded surprised. Your signals went dark. Because the signal men are dead. He said it flatly. Not grief yet. The grief would come later, when there was time. 3 of them. They held the fire, and the dead put them out. The men and the fires both. Jon looked at the gorge. At the dead that filled it, white bodies, dozens, piled in the narrow space. At the living who remained, fewer than there should have been, the fighters who had held through the night, looking less like soldiers and more like men who had survived a natural disaster. How many did you lose? Jon said. 30. No, 32. Ferrin and his boy went down at the end when the last push came through. Tormund spat blood. They were good men. Ferrin made decent arrows. His boy was 13. Kept the fire going while his father shot. Good men. Jon knelt beside Tormund. He looked at the arm. That's broken. I know it's broken. I heard it break. White had a club. Used to be a tree branch, I think. Hit me across the forearm, and I heard the bone go, and I kept swinging with the other arm, because what else are you going to do? He looked at Jon. You shouldn't be here. You should be at the fist. Running the map. Being the king. The king is here because his friends stopped sending signals, and the king doesn't leave his friends in the dark. Kingly answer. Shut up. Let me look at the arm. Jon set the arm. He was not a maester. He had learned bone setting from a free folk woman who had learnt it from a free folk woman who had learnt it from a free folk woman, going back to the dawn of time. The unbroken chain of northern medicine that did not have maesters or chains or the citadel, but that kept people alive anyway. He set the arm and bound it, and Tormund swore steadily through the whole process in old tongue so foul that even the white corpses would have blushed. I'm pulling you back, Jon said. The hell you are. Tormund, your arm is broken. Your signal men are dead. You've lost 30 fighters. I'm sending fresh men and pulling your wounded out. The gorge will be held by fresh men who have 2 working arms. You'll be at the fist. Healing, eating, annoying me. Jon looked at the big man. This is not a request. Tormund held his gaze. In the gorge, the frozen wind. The dead, piled. The living, exhausted, fine. Tormund said, But I'm coming back. The moment this arm holds an axe, I know you will. Don't let anyone touch my gorge. It's not your gorge. It bloody well is. I bled in it. That makes it mine. Jon helped him up. They walked out of the gorge together, the king and the giant, and behind them the fresh fighters filed in to take the line, and the defense held for another night, because a man had set a broken arm and rotated the wounded and kept the network breathing. That was what the long night was. In the middle, not glory, not heroism, not the great battles the songs would sing about. It was logistics. It was setting broken arms and rotating fighters and keeping the signal fires lit and the dragonglass distributed and the food moving and the wounded treated. It was the work that nobody would remember and that made the survival possible. The 10,000 small decisions that kept 15,000 people alive for one more day while the dark pressed in from every direction. Jon made those decisions. Every day. Every night. For 12 days, until the thing that had to happen happened, and the dead broke through, and the defense contracted, and the last stand began. On the 8th day, Mance died. He died in the Fist's infirmary, which was a cave with a fire and a woman who knew herbs. He had been failing for months, the old tiredness, the body that had carried too much for too long. He had held on through the beginning of the long night because he was Mance Raider and holding on was what he did, and then his body had decided that holding on was no longer an option. Jon was with him at the end. Don't stop, Mance said. His voice was thin, but the eyes were still sharp. Still the eyes that had seen through 100 chieftains' lies and held 100 clans together and lost them and watched another man pick them up and do it differently. Whatever happens, don't stop. I won't, Jon said. The dead want you to stop. They want the line to break. They want the living to do what the living always do. Scatter, run, think of themselves first. You hold the line, and the dead run out of dead. That's the whole of it. Outlast them. How do you outlast something that doesn't die? You die slower. Mance almost smiled. The old smile, the one that had charmed 100 chieftains. I know that's not a strategy, but it's the truth. The dead have numbers, but they have no will of their own. Kill the thing that drives them, the White Walkers, the Night King, whatever he is, and the dead fall. Every one of them. They're puppets. Cut the strings. You're asking me to kill the Night King. I'm asking you to find a way. Mance held his gaze. You've been finding ways for 10 years. Finding ways is what you do. The goat, the Thens, the dragonglass. You find ways that other men don't see because they're looking at the problem the way they were taught to look at it, and you look at it from the side, because you're a crow who became free folk, and a man who lives between two worlds sees things that men in one world can't. Jon held the dying man's hand. Thank you, Jon said, for keeping me alive. 10 years ago, when you had every reason not to. Mance's hand squeezed. Barely. You were worth the gamble, Mance said. Turns out, he died that evening, quietly, with the long night raging outside the cave, and the defense he had inspired holding against the dark. Jon sat with him until the body was cold, and then he went outside and told Tormund and Sigurd and the men, and the free folk burned Mance Raider's body on a pyre on the fist of the first men, the last king beyond the wall, the man who had held them first, and the flames went up into the dark sky, and the dark sky watched them without interest. Jon went back to the map. He did not have time to grieve. He would grieve later, if there was a later. Now there was the war, and the war needed the man who held the map. The Battle of the Fist. How it ended. On the 12th day, the dead broke the eastern line. The Hornfoot position, a defended stretch of frozen forest that Jon had trusted to hold because the terrain was dense and the dead moved poorly in trees, collapsed when the cold intensified beyond what the fire trenches could survive. The fires went out. Not banked, not smothered, extinguished by a cold that was colder than fire, the cold of the White Walkers themselves, moving behind the White Army for the first time, bringing their own winter with them. The Hornfoots ran. Jon could not blame them when the fires went out and the dead came through unburned in the dark. Holding was not an option. They ran south, toward the Fist, and the dead followed them, and the eastern line ceased to exist. The defense contracted. Jon pulled everyone in. The Frostfang passes, the Milkwater Gorge, abandoned both of them, the Thens and Tormund's fighters, pulling back to the Fist in a retreat that was organized enough to be a maneuver and desperate enough to be a rout. The Free Folk Army. What was left of it? 22,000 when the long night started. 15,000 now. Gathered on the ancient hill of the first men and made its last stand. The Night King came on the 13th day. Jon saw him. He came from the north, walking, not riding, a figure in the darkness that was darker than the darkness around it, a thing that was not a man and had not been a man for 8,000 years, with eyes that were the blue of glaciers and the cold of the world's end around him, in a radius that killed the air. He walked through his own army, the dead parting for him like water parts for a stone, and he stopped at the edge of the firelight, just beyond the range of the living's boughs, and he looked up at the Fist. He looked at Jon. Jon felt it. The look. Across the distance and the darkness and the army of the dead, the Night King looked at Jon Snow, and Jon felt the full weight of what he was facing. Not a general, not a king in the southern sense, but something older and worse. A force of winter given form, the cold made conscious and hungry and patient and utterly, completely without mercy. He was afraid. He was more afraid than he had ever been, more than the night he left the wall, more than the night at the Twins where Tormund had killed the White, more than any moment in 10 years of living beyond the wall. He was afraid because the thing looking at him was not something a man could fight with a sword, or a plan, or a defense on a leather map. It was something that existed to end the world, and Jon was standing between it and the world with 15,000 people who trusted him. "Jon," Ygritte's voice. Behind him, in the firelight. He turned. She was there, bow in hand, quiver of dragon-glass-tipped arrows on her back, the red hair tied back for the fighting. Torren was with the other children, in the caves behind the fist, with the old people and the wounded, the ones who could not fight and who would die last if the line fell. "Don't look at him," she said. "Look at me." He looked at her. "You're the king beyond the wall," she said. "Not because anyone crowned you, because you're the man who's standing here when standing here is the worst place in the world to be. That's what a king is. A man who stands." "I don't know how to kill him," Jon said. "Then figure it out." She kissed him, hard, the free folk way, not gentle, not soft. The kiss of a woman who was going to fight beside the man she loved and who wanted him to remember what he was fighting for. You always figure it out. That's the annoying thing about you. She moved to the line. Jon drew Longclaw, the Valyrian steel-blade old bear Mormont had given him at Castle Black, the Mormont ancestral sword that Jon had carried north with the half-hand and through the years with the free folk. He had kept it. The Watch had given it to him, and he had taken it beyond the wall and never given it back, the one piece of the life he'd left that he could not put down. Valyrian steel killed White Walkers. He had learned that in the fighting, in the passes, the old magic in the blade answering the old magic in the dead, and Longclaw was the finest Valyrian steel he had ever held, and he went to the front of the defense. Because Mance had told him not to be a hero, but Mance was dead, and the Night King was at the door, and this was not a time for the man with the map, but a time for the man with the blade. The dead charged the fist. They came up the hill in a wave, not tactical, not organized, just the massive pressure of 100,000 dead things moving toward the living with the simple hunger of winter itself. They hit the fire trenches, and the fire held some, and the cold extinguished others, and the dead poured through the gaps. And the free folk met them with dragonglass and steel and the desperate courage of people who had nowhere left to run. Jon fought. He fought the way a man fights when he is not fighting for victory, but for time. Every white he brought down was a second bought. Every step the dead did not advance was a breath the living took. And the math was terrible, and the night was long, and the dead kept coming. Ghost fought beside him. The wolf, who had been at his side for a decade, tore through the dead with the ferocity of a creature that did not know fear and did not understand retreat. Whites fell to the wolf's teeth, not killed, not truly, but brought down, torn apart, slowed. The wolf doing the thing the wolf had always done, standing between Jon and whatever was trying to kill him. Tormund fought. Sigorn fought. Ygritte's arrows flew from the rampart, each one tipped with dragonglass, each one finding a target in the mass of the dead. The free folk fought with everything they had, and it was not enough. Not nearly, because the dead did not stop, and the living were running out of living to spend. And then Jon saw the thing Mance had told him to look for. The White Walkers. Behind the White Army. Not fighting, directing, standing in the dark, the blue figures, the commanders, the things that controlled the dead the way a puppeteer controlled the strings. When a White Walker fell, the whites it had raised fell too, crumbled, collapsed. The animation going out of them like flame going out of a candle. Kill the controllers. Cut the strings. The walkers. Jon roared over the noise. The White Walkers behind the line. Dragonglass to the walkers. Ygritte heard him. She turned her bow from the whites to the darkness behind them, and she fired, and the dragonglass arrow found a White Walker in the chest, and the thing exploded into ice, and the whites it had raised, 50, 100, more, collapsed into the snow like puppets with cut strings. The free folk saw it. The word went down the line. The walkers, aim for the walkers, and the archers and the fighters with dragonglass blades stopped wasting their obsidian on the whites and started hunting the controllers, the blue figures in the dark, and every walker that fell took its dead with it, and the tide began, impossibly, to turn. The Night King saw what was happening. He moved forward, into the firelight, toward the line, and the cold came with him. A cold that extinguished the fire trenches and froze the ground and killed the weaker fighters where they stood, the cold of the thing itself, and the free folk line bent under it. Jon went to meet him. He did not decide to do it. His body decided. The same body that had refused to climb the wall 10 years ago, that had stood in Mance's tent and told the truth when lying was safer, that had drawn lines on leather and settled goat disputes and earned the trust of a people who had every reason to hate him. The body that had been making the right stupid decision for a decade made one more. He went down the hill, through the gap in the line, toward the Night King, with his dragonglass-tipped sword and his white wolf and nothing else. The Night King raised his hand. Jon felt the cold hit him, the full cold, the cold of the abyss, the cold that was not winter, but the absence of everything that was not winter. It went through his cloak and his mail and his skin and into his bones, and he kept walking, because there was nothing else to do, because stopping was dying, and dying was losing, and losing was every person on that hill dying too. Ghost hit the Night King from the side. The wolf, silent, always silent, the silence that had named him, came out of the dark and struck the Night King with his full weight, and the Night King staggered, and the cold faltered for a half-second, and in that half-second, Jon Snow crossed the last distance and drove Longclaw through the Night King's chest. The Night King looked at him, the blue eyes, up close, the face that was not a face, the ancient intelligence that had watched the world for 8,000 years and decided to end it. Jon pushed Longclaw deeper. The Night King shattered, not slowly, all at once, the way ice shatters when you drive a pick into it, the whole structure failing at the point of impact. He came apart into shards of ice and frost, and the cold that had been concentrated in him blew outward, and then nothing. A space where the Night King had been. Empty air, empty cold. Just the night. The ordinary night. Without the thing that had made it long. And across the battlefield, in the passes and the gorges and the frozen forest, 100,000 dead collapsed. They fell like they'd been switched off. One moment fighting, clawing, pressing against the living with the terrible hunger of the unliving, and then down, all at once, every white in the army falling to the snow, as the thing that drove them ceased to exist. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Jon had ever heard. He stood in the snow, his sword in his hand, the shattered remains of the Night King at his feet, and Ghost beside him, and 15,000 living free folk on the hill behind him, and the long night was over. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel relief. He felt tired. He felt the deepest, most complete tiredness he had ever known, a tiredness that went past the body, into the place where the carrying lived, the place that had been holding 30,000 people, and a war, and a defense, and a dozen chieftains' trust for a decade. The carrying was done. The thing he had been carrying was over, and the tiredness that had been waiting behind the carrying rushed in to fill the space the carrying left. He sat down in the snow. Ghost lay down beside him. They sat together, the man and the wolf, in the silence of a world that had just been saved, and Jon Snow, king beyond the wall, did not feel like a king. He felt like a man who had been standing for a very long time and who had finally been given permission to sit. He sat. The dawn came. The morning after, what was left? The free folk, counted their dead in the long pale morning that followed the long night, and the counting was its own kind of silence. 15,000 had stood on the hill, 9,000 walked off it, 6,000 dead. Free folk, Hornfoots and River Clan, and Thens and Wanderers, and the small bands that had never had names, the people who had come to Jon's fire over a decade with their goat disputes and their boundary problems and their trust, given reluctantly and painfully, and who had stood in a line and fought the dead and died in a frozen field because a man they called king told them where to stand. Jon walked the field. He did not have to. He could have stayed in the command post, read reports, tallied numbers. But Ned Stark had raised him to look at what his decisions cost, and 6,000 free folk dead on a hillside was a thing he was not going to learn about from a piece of leather. The dead lay in the snow in the attitudes of their dying. Some had fallen fighting. Some had been frozen where they stood by the Night King's cold. Some had been small, children, old people, the ones from the caves who had died when the cold got through, not from the whites, but from the winter itself, the weapon that needed no army. He found a woman he knew, a Hornfoot elder who had brought him the goat problem 9 years ago, the first dispute that had come to his fire, the beginning of whatever he had become. She had died in the caves. Frozen. Her face was peaceful, which was a lie. Nobody froze to death peacefully. They shook and gasped, and the body fought its own ending until the ending won. He knelt beside her. "I'm sorry," he said. He knew it meant nothing. The dead did not hear apologies, but he said it to everybody he recognized, which was a great many of them, because he had spent a decade learning their names and their disputes and their lives, and the bodies in the snow were not numbers to him, but people, and the people deserved to be spoken to. Ygritte found him on the field. She was alive. She had a cut across her forearm from a white's blade, and her quiver was empty, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Standing in the dawn with the snow melting on her red hair and the bow across her back and the fierce face that had been the first thing he had chosen 10 years ago when he stood at the base of the wall and decided not to climb. "Torrhen's alive," she said. "The cave's held." Jon closed his eyes. The relief was physical, a release of a fear he had been carrying so deep that he had forgotten he was carrying it. "Thank the gods," he said. "Thank the rock. The cave's deep, and the cold didn't reach the back." She looked at the field. At the dead. 6,000. "About that. Could have been all of us." "Yes. It wasn't because of you. Because you built the defense and got the dragonglass and told every thick-headed chieftain where to stand. A lot of them are dead now. The ones who are alive wouldn't be without you." She touched his arm. Not gently, firmly, the free folk way. "Don't disappear into the grief, Jon. There's time for grief. There'll be a lot of time. But right now, the living need the man who led them. They need to see you standing, not kneeling by the dead." He stood. She was right. She was always right. The free folk needed to see their king alive and whole and standing, because the dawn after a catastrophe was the most dangerous moment for a leader, the moment when the holding together could come apart, when grief and exhaustion could dissolve the thing that had survived the worst of it. He went back to the camp. He was the king. The king stood. The weeks after. What the living did. They burned the dead first. Every body. Free folk. White. The remains of the dead army and the remains of the living one. The free folk burned their dead because the dead rose if you didn't. And because the burning was the oldest right the free folk had, older than any southern sept or godswood, the fire that sent the Gon to whatever was next. Jon stood at every pyre. He did not speak. The free folk did not make speeches over their dead. Speeches were Neela business. He just stood and watched and remembered. Then they rebuilt. The defense network, the agreements, the boundaries on leather, all of it had been torn apart by the long night, the neat lines smeared and overwritten by the chaos of retreat and battle and death. Jon started over. Not from scratch. The relationships were still there. The trust was still there. The decade of work had created a foundation that the dead had damaged but not destroyed. But the lines needed redrawing. The positions needed reassigning. 9,000 people, not 30,000, needed less territory, but more of it needed to be closer together, because the long night had left scars that went deeper than the body, and the free folk wanted to be near each other in a way they had not before. For a month, maybe 2, it felt like the thing Jon had built was going to hold. The clans stayed together. Tormund's people, and Sigorn's Thens, and the Hornfoots, and the River Clan, and the scattered others, they remained in the orbit of the Fist, in Jon's network, under Jon's authority, because the terror was still fresh, and the memory of what the unity had brought them was still vivid. And then the dead were gone, and the terror began to fade, and the free folk began, very slowly, to be the free folk again. Jon and the boy. What kings owe? Torrhen found him on the Fist, 3 days after the long night ended. The boy was 6, and he had spent the battle in the caves, and he had heard all of it. The fighting, the screaming, the cold that had killed the torches in the rear tunnels, the mothers who had held the children in the dark, and told them stories to cover the sound of the dying above. He came out into the dawn looking older than 6, the way all the children came out looking older, aged by a single night, the way war aged men over years. "Da," he said. Jon picked him up. He held his son against his chest and felt the boy's weight and warmth and the small heartbeat that was the one sound in the world Jon would have traded everything else to keep hearing. Torrhen's arms went around his neck. The boy's face pressed into his shoulder. "Is it done?" Torrhen said, muffled. "It's done." "Are the dead gone?" "All of them." "Are you hurt?" "Not badly." Torrhen pulled back and looked at his father's face with the grey eyes that were Jon's eyes, and, through Jon, Winterfell's eyes, and through Winterfell, everything Jon had left behind a decade ago. "You went down the hill," Torrhen said. "Mama said. She said you went down the hill toward the dead thing, the big one." And she thought. He stopped. He was 6. He did not have the words for what his mother had thought, watching her man walk toward the Night King. "I came back," Jon said. "Don't do it again." "I'll try not to." "Promise." Jon looked at his son. He thought about promises, about the vow he had broken at the wall and the promises he had kept since, to Ygritte, to Mance, to the free folk, to every chieftain who had brought a dispute to his fire and trusted the line he drew. He had broken the one oath that was supposed to be forever and had kept 100 lesser ones, and the 100 had somehow added up to more than the one. "I promise," he said. Torrhen put his head back on Jon's shoulder. Jon held his son on the hilltop where the kingdom had been built and the Night King had fallen, and he thought about what Mance had said, that being a king was kneeling when your people needed you to kneel. And he thought that being a father was similar. It was making promises to a 6-year-old and knowing you might not be able to keep them, and making them anyway, because the making was what the child needed, and the keeping was what the man owed. He carried Torrhen back to the cave. Ghost walked beside them. Ygritte was at the entrance, bow still across her back even now, the free folk woman who never stopped being ready. "He found you," she said. "He found me. He wouldn't stop asking, all through the rebuild. Where's Dar? Is Dar alive? Why won't Dar come home? She looked at Jon with the expression that was equal parts love and exasperation. You need to come home more. Home is a cave in the Frostfangs. Home is wherever I am. You know that. She took Torren from his arms. Come inside. Eat. Sleep. Be a person for one day before you go back to being a king. I'm not inside. He went inside. He ate. He slept. He was a person for one day, a man with a woman and a boy and a wolf, in a cave in the north, the world saved and the saving done, and the being a person suddenly possible again after a decade of being something larger. It was the best day of his life. He would need to remember that later, when the kingdom began to dissolve, and the free folk began to scatter, and the thing he had built started coming apart, that the best day of his life was not the day he killed the Night King, or the day the free folk named him king, or the day the dead fell. The best day was the day after, when his son found him on a hill, and he went home and ate and slept and was nobody in particular. That was the day worth keeping. Everything else was just the work. The dissolving, how a kingdom ends. It started with the Hornfoots. They were not a warlike clan. They were walkers. Their name came from the barefoot wandering that defined their culture, the restless movement through the frozen north that was not migration, but identity, the walking that made them who they were. The long night had forced them to stand still, to hold a position, to be something they were not. And now the dead were gone, and the standing was done, and the walking was calling them, as the walking always called them. And the Hornfoot elders came to Jon's fire one morning and told him they were going. Going where? Jon said, though he already knew. North, the elder said. East, the old routes, the walking places. She was an old woman, one of the ones who had survived the caves, and she had the Hornfoot eyes, always moving, always looking at the horizon, the eyes of a people who did not stay. We fought for you, Snow. We stood when you told us to stand. We did that. It's done now. The dead are done. We're going back to being what we are. Jon looked at her. He wanted to argue. The part of him that had spent a decade building the network, the agreements, the lines on leather, that part wanted to say, stay. The defense holds better with all of us. The next threat, whatever it is, will be easier to face if we're together. Don't scatter. Don't go back to being 100 separate bands when we've been one thing. He did not say it. He did not say it because Ygritte had told him, years ago, what the free folk were, and she had been right. They were free. The freedom was the point. The unity had been a fist clenched against the dark, and the dark was gone, and a fist clenched around nothing was just a hand in pain. Thank you, Jon said, for fighting. Thank you for knowing where to put us, the elder said, and she smiled, the walking smile, the smile of a woman who was about to do the thing she was made for. You're a good king, Snow, for a crow. I'm not a king, Jon said. You were when we needed one. She touched his hand, briefly, a Hornfoot goodbye. That's enough. The Hornfoots left that week. They went north and east, back to the old routes, the walking places, the frozen country that was theirs by custom and by wandering. Jon watched them go from the top of the fist, and he felt the first piece of the thing he had built detach and float away, and he did not reach for it. Because reaching would have made him the thing the free folk feared, a king who would not let go. The river clans went next, then the smaller bands, the families, the wanderers, the people who had come to Jon's territory for protection during the dead years, and who were now going home to the places that had been too dangerous to live in, and were not anymore. Each departure was its own small grief. Jon knew each clan. He knew their elders. He knew the disputes he had settled, and the lines he had drawn, and the trust that had been built one goat at a time. And each clan that left took a piece of the trust with it, the way a retreating tide took sand, and the shape of the thing Jon had built grew smaller and simpler with each departing fire. Tormund stayed longer than most. He stayed through the spring that came. Finally, after the long night, the slow warming, the ice receding, the land remembering that it could be something other than frozen. He stayed because Tormund was loyal in a way that the free folk did not have a word for. The loyalty of a man who had fought beside another man for a decade and who could not quite bring himself to walk away from it. But Tormund was free folk too. He came to Jon's fire one evening with a skin of something that was not wine and was not water, and that burned the throat in a way that suggested it had been made by a man who did not care about throats. "I'm going," Tormund said. Jon did not ask where. He had been waiting for this. "The real north," Tormund said. "Past the Frostfangs. The places nobody goes. I've been south, relatively south, for too long. I need the sky over me and the snow under me and nobody within a day's ride." He drank. "My people are coming with me. What's left of them?" "I know," Jon said. "Do you want to come?" Jon looked at the fire. He thought about it. He thought about the real north, the country beyond the Frostfangs, the empty, beautiful, terrible places where the sky was bigger than anything, and a man could live or die on his own terms without a line drawn on leather or a dispute to settle or a title he had never asked for. He thought about the freedom of it, the possibility. "No," Jon said, "I'll stay here." "What for?" "The kingdom's gone, Snow. The Hornfoots are walking. The river clans are fishing. The Thens are back in their valleys. You're king of what? A hill? A wolf? That red-headed woman who's too good for you?" "The hill," Jon said. "The wolf. The woman. My son." He looked at Tormund. "There'll be people who come back. People who wander for a while and then come back to the Fist because this is where the agreements live, and this is where the disputes get settled. Somebody should be here when they come. You're going to sit on a hill and wait for people to bring you their goat problems again." "It's what I do," Jon said. Tormund looked at him. The big man's face did something Jon had rarely seen. Went soft, briefly, the way rock goes soft when water runs over it for a long time. Not sentimental. Tormund was not a man who did sentiment, but warm, in the way that warmth was the best the world offered. "You're a good man, Jon Snow," Tormund said. "You were a good man when you were a shit crow, and you were a good man when you were a shit free folk, and you're a good man now, when you're a king with no kingdom, and a man sitting on a hill." He raised the skin. "To the king beyond the wall. Long may he sit on his hill." "Shut up, Tormund. Can't. Not built for quiet. You know that." They drank. They talked. Not about the dead or the war or the kingdom that was dissolving around them. About old things. Hunts. Fights. The first winter they had survived together. The white by the milkwater. The night Tormund had saved Jon's life with a torch. The stories that men told each other when the telling was what mattered, not the facts. Tormund left in the morning. He embraced Jon, the full Tormund embrace, the kind that made your ribs creak and your feet leave the ground. "I'll come back," Tormund said. "Now and then. When the quiet gets too loud, I'll come drink your bad wine and tell your boy about the time I fought a bear." He paused. "The story gets better every time I tell it. By the time your boy's old enough to drink, I'll have killed 2 bears. 3, Jon said. 4. Why stop at 3? Tormund grinned, the full Tormund grin. "Take care of yourself, Snow, and that wolf. He's earned a rest." Tormund walked north. Jon watched him go, the big man and his band, 20 or so, heading into the country that had tried to kill them all, and that was, now, just country again, just the north, cold and empty and waiting. Then Jon went back to the fire. Sigorn left 3 weeks later. The Thens went back to the Frostfang valleys, the high country that was home. the place their people had lived for 1,000 years and would live for 1,000 more. Sigurd came to Jon before he left and shook his hand. The first time they had shaken hands, ever, and said nothing, because the Thenns did not do sentiment either, and the handshake said it all. And then it was quiet. Not empty. There were still people at the fist, a few hundred, the ones who had nowhere else to go, or who had decided that the hill, with the man and the wolf and the lines on leather, was home enough. There were traders who came through, and wanderers, and free folk from the clans who had gone south through the wall years ago, and who came back north sometimes to visit and to bring news. There were even a few crows, watch rangers who crossed the wall on patrol, and who stopped at the fist because the man there would give them water and news and ask them, in return, for news from the south. Jon had built bridges, not between armies, between people. The free folk and the watch were not allies, not in any formal sense, but they were not enemies anymore either. And the not being enemies was Jon's doing, the product of a decade of translating between two worlds that had spent 8,000 years misunderstanding each other. It was not a kingdom. It was what came after a kingdom, the residue, the memory, the continuing practice of the things the kingdom had established. The boundaries still existed in people's heads, even when the leather had been rolled up. The agreements still held even when the chieftains who had signed them were scattered across the north. The trust was still there, the trust that Jon had built one dispute at a time, and trust did not dissolve when the people who held it walked away. It went with them. Migritte, the last conversation. She came to him in the evening, when the camp was quiet and the fire was low, and Torrin was sleeping in the cave with Ghost curled around him, the boy and the wolf, in the companionship that had been there since Torrin was old enough to grab white fur. "So," Ygritte said. "So," Jon said. "They're gone. Most of them. The kingdom you didn't want to build is gone. It was never a kingdom. It was something." She sat beside him. Not across the fire. Beside him, shoulder to shoulder, the way they had sat on 1,000 evenings for a decade. "It was the closest thing the free folk have ever had to something. And you built it, and now it's gone. And you're sitting here looking at a fire like a man who lost a fight. I didn't lose. No, you won. You killed the Night King and saved the free folk and held the line when the line was the only thing between the living and the dead. You won everything." She looked at him. "So why do you look like a man who lost?" Jon held the fire's light. He thought about the answer. The real one. Not the easy one. "Because I thought it would last," he said. "I know that's stupid. I knew from the beginning that the free folk were the free folk, and that holding them together was like holding water in your hands. You could do it. But the moment you opened your fingers, the water would run. I knew that. But I thought..." He stopped. "I thought maybe. That maybe the thing we built, the agreements and the trust and the lines, maybe it would outlast the reason it was built. Maybe they'd stay because staying was better than scattering. Maybe I'd built something that was worth keeping even without the dead at the door." "You did," Ygritte said. "They left. They left because they're free. That's not the same as the thing not being worth keeping. It's the thing being what it was." She put her hand on his arm. "Jon, listen. The free folk don't stay because a thing is good. They don't build castles and sit in them. They don't make kingdoms that last 1,000 years. They make what they need for as long as they need it. And then they take it apart and move on. And the thing they made still matters, even though it's gone. The making mattered. The standing mattered. The lines on the leather mattered. The goat mattered. She almost smiled. Even the goat. You're telling me the kingdom was always going to dissolve? I'm telling you the kingdom did what it was for. The free folk survived. The dead are gone. The children are alive. Torrhen is alive. And the free folk who scattered. They scatter with the memory of what it was like to stand together. They scatter with the knowledge that a man on a hill will settle their disputes and give them a fair line. That doesn't go away, because the clans go home. She looked at the fire. You gave the free folk something they never had. Not a kingdom. A memory of one. And a memory of a kingdom is better than a kingdom, because a kingdom can be broken and a memory can't. Jon looked at her. When did you get so wise? He said. I've been wise the whole time. You've been too busy drawing lines on leather to notice. She leaned against his shoulder. I told you. You know nothing, Jon Snow. You're still saying that. I'll be saying it when we're both old and grey, and Torrhen has children of his own, and you're still sitting on this hill, waiting for someone to bring you a goat problem. She closed her eyes. It'll always be true. The knowing nothing. It's part of you. It's the best part, actually, because a man who knows nothing is a man who's still learning. And a man who's still learning is a man who can still change. And a man who can still change is the only kind of man the free folk will ever follow. Jon put his arm around her. They sat on the hill where the kingdom had been, in the evening, with the fire and the cold and the vast northern sky above them, and the kingdom was gone, and the woman was here, and the wolf was here, and the boy was sleeping in the cave, and Jon Snow, who had been a crow and then a spy, and then a free folk man and then a king, was now just a man on a hill with the people he loved. It was enough. It had always been enough. He had just been too busy saving the world to notice. What if Jon Snow became king beyond the wall? He became one. Not the way southern kings became kings, not through blood or conquest or the passing of a crown. He became king because the people around him needed a king, and he was the only one standing. He had been a crow, a spy, a man who lied his way into a world he did not belong to and then chose to stay in it, not because the staying was easy, but because the leaving was worse. He had earned the trust of people who were right to distrust him, one goat at a time, one dispute at a time, one winter at a time, until the distrust wore through, and what was underneath was not loyalty exactly. The free folk did not do loyalty the way the South did, but something like it, something that held. He held the line against the dead. He held it because Mance had taught him how to hold things together, and because Ygritte had taught him what was worth holding, and because Tormund had taught him that standing next to a man in the dark was the whole meaning of the word friend. He held the line, and the Night King fell, and the living walked away from the long night carrying the memory of the man who had told them where to stand. And then the kingdom dissolved, not in war or betrayal or the collapse of something broken. In freedom. The free folk went back to being free, because freedom was the point, had always been the point. And a king who tried to hold free folk past the moment of need was not a king they had chosen, but a cage they had not consented to. Jon let them go. He opened his hand, and the water ran through his fingers, and the water was still water, and the hand was still a hand, and the holding had been real even though it was over. He stayed on the hill. He stayed with Ygritte and Torrhen and Ghost and the fire and the lines on leather that nobody needed anymore, and that he kept anyway. Because a man does not throw away the thing he built even when the building's purpose has been served. He stayed because the hill was home now, the only home he had ever fully chosen, and because the free folk who wandered would sometimes wander back, and when they did, they would find the man on the hill with the wolf and the fire and the fair line, and they would know that the thing they had built was still there, in the one man who had never left it. He had not built a kingdom, he had built a memory, and the memory, the free folk, the battle, the standing together, The long night and the dawn that followed that would outlast any kingdom the world had ever known. Because kingdoms fell. They fell to war and time and the ambitions of the men who inherited them. But a memory of people standing together in the dark, holding the line because a man they trusted told them where to stand, that was older than ice and would last longer. Jon Snow. King beyond the wall. The crow who stayed. He sat on his hill. The north was quiet. Ghost lay beside him, white fur against white snow, red eyes watching the tree line as they always did, patient and silent and unafraid. Ygritte was inside, with the boy. The fire burned, and somewhere in the distance, too far to see but not too far to feel, the free folk wandered, as they always had and always would, carrying in them the memory of the king who had not held them but had held the line, and who was still there, on his hill, in case they needed him again. They probably would. He'd be ready.